For more than an hour, the entire staff of the surgical department was in tension, and the operating room fought for the life of a well-known artist in the city, and no one knew how it would end. The operation itself was not very complicated, but a huge number of associated diseases of the patient could easily send him to the other world. Finally, the door of the operating room with a creak opened, and the patient was taken to the ward. Thank goodness. It's all over, the elderly orderly sighed in relief. That was an hour and a half Johnson was operated on. You'll definitely live now, the young nurse looked at her with some reproach and said, I didn't even doubt that everything would be fine. After all, operated Michael Mikhailovich. He's young, but he's a very good specialist. Our head says that Mikhailovich was born already a ready-made doctor. The girl stopped abruptly, and with loving eyes saw the surgeon leaving the operating room. She had been trying to get the doctor's attention for a long time, but it was as if he didn't notice it. In fact, Michael saw everything, understood everything. But, having recently gone through a divorce, was not ready for a new relationship. Too hard for him, everything went with Emily, his now ex-wife. He met her when he was in his last year of college. One day a fellow student suggested going to the nearest cafe, and he agreed, although he rarely went to such places. By coincidence, Emily was there that evening at a colleague's birthday party. Michael almost immediately noticed a spectacular blonde in a tight blue dress. For a while he watched her from the sidelines. He liked the way she moved, smiled, and simply fixed her hair. Realizing that he should not miss the chance to get acquainted with this beauty, he gathered his courage and invited her to a slow dance. In communication, she was also easy and flawless. From the first minutes, it seemed to Michael that he knew her for 100 years. After about half an hour, he asked her to run away, and Emily surprisingly cheerfully said, Let's do it. I hate all these pompous toasts in honor of the birthday girl. I'm pretty sure that behind her eyes, every other person at the table envies Leslie, the rich husband, the business. I've already congratulated her, given her a gift, so I have every right to disappear. Michael remembered every moment of that evening. Even years later, they took late-night walks along the city embankment, telling each other about themselves, and they had a lot in common. They both liked to read science fiction and watch the same movies. And it turned out that both of their parents had died just a year apart. Michael's mother and father were in a car accident, returning from vacation, and Emily's parents crashed on a plane. After walking her home that night, Michael caught himself thinking that he absolutely hated to break up. After learning that Emily worked downtown at a large grocery store, he rushed to her the very next day after school and bought a bouquet of flowers. Emily was surprised, but agreed to meet again, so spun their romance. Michael fell in love, and then it seemed that Emily reciprocated him. A month later, she moved into his apartment, which Michael got after the death of his parents. A couple of weeks later, they applied to the registry office and without any noisy wedding quietly signed. Emily, of course, wanted to organize a festive feast in a restaurant, but the money at that time in the young family was not much, and they decided to postpone the festive part of the ceremony to a little later. In addition, it soon became known that Emily is pregnant, and about the white dress and a lavish wedding again had to forget. The first few years, everything in their family was fine. Michael, having received a diploma, got a job at the city hospital, where they were happy to take the best graduate of the year. Emily, having given birth to a son, was engaged in the child and household chores. Her husband tried to help her in everything. At night, if necessary, he himself got up to his son, giving him a chance to sleep. And then, having slept only a couple of hours, went to work. But it was as if his wife didn't notice. At every opportunity, Emily arranged scandals and every time persuaded, all the same as people alone, we are on your pennies to survive. I want now, not later, to live like a man, go to salons, wear fashionable clothes, not these cheap rags. How many times have you been offered to go to a private clinic? And you're treating the poor. Michael, like a schoolboy, tried to justify himself by saying that he was treating people like themselves, and that everyone has the right to be healthy at some point. He even caught himself thinking that he had already gotten used to such conversations of hers, explaining it with postpartum depression, which is bound to pass. It was glad that the scandals were not every day, and sometimes he went into the house with joy, hearing the cheerful laughter of his wife and son and inhaling with his nose the favorite aroma of pies. Things changed dramatically when Emily came out of maternity leave to work. She was promoted to manager almost immediately, and she began to spend a lot of time in her store. Michael had to pick up his son from daycare most days, and on days when he had an operation or duty, the neighbor Mrs. Thompson helped. His wife no longer made scandals, as it was before, did not demand money, could buy everything herself on her salary. But they began to live as strangers to each other. There were no more evening walks together. On weekends, there were more and more frequent late arrivals and departures of the wife, ostensibly for some incident at work. Once, when he returned home, He saw a light in the window from the street. It was quite late, and his wife usually put her son to bed at that time if she was home, and went to bed without waiting for Michael. Emily was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, nervously tapping her spoon on the table, waiting for her husband to come in. Emily, without raising her eyes, began to speak. "So, darling, I'm fed up with everything. So I filed for divorce today. I thought when I got married that with your credentials you'd be the best surgeon in town. I even dreamed you'd open your own clinic. But I guess you don't want that. You'd rather spend your life working for pennies." Michael stood up in surprise and barely audibly said, "But why pennies? We've always had enough for everything. We're not poor." But Emily was unstoppable. She jumped up from her chair, came right up to him and said in an even angrier tone, "We had enough for everything. What did we have enough for? I want to travel abroad, go to restaurants. That's it. This conversation is over. Tomorrow morning I take my son and leave. By the way, I filed for child support right away." Michael didn't have time to say anything else before Emily slammed the door and went to bed as if nothing had happened. He sat at the kitchen table for another hour, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the morning, Michael decided that he would not keep Emily knowing her character. He knew perfectly well that it was useless. And it was really impossible to live the way they had been living lately. In all this situation, he felt sorry only for Tom, but he hoped that his wife would be smart enough to let him see his son after the divorce. In court, Emily made a whole performance with tears and a story about their terrible, as she said, their life in marriage. Michael was shocked as he listened to the woman he had loved all these years slinging mud at him. "You have no idea how hard it is when your husband relieves stress with alcohol almost every day, and then has a showdown sobbing feignedly," the wife said, and then, blotting her eyes with a pre-prepared handkerchief, continued, "Yes, he at his work sometimes could disappear for 24 hours. Probably there he found a young hussy and is having affairs, spitting on his family, on his son." It was impossible to listen to this nonsense calmly. Michael did not use alcohol at all, believing that in his profession it is inadmissible. For all the years of life with Emily, he only once on New Year's Eve allowed himself to drink a couple of glasses of champagne, and in court, according to his wife, he turned out to be a real alcoholic. In the end, he managed with great difficulty to get himself rare visits with his son, and that only when it was convenient for the ex-wife. She, in turn, tried to make sure that they saw as little as possible. It was the hardest time for Michael, and he lived as if in a dream. The only thing that saved him was work, although the department had its own difficulties. The head of the department was constantly making some machinations, and everyone, knowing about it, kept silent, receiving money for unscheduled money. He said that he was doing everything for the good of the department, but only the funds received disappeared without a trace in his office. Once Michael stuttered that the money that will come after the next operation, it would be necessary to buy some equipment for work, but immediately he was rudely interrupted. "Maybe the head of the department is still in this department after all. I think without you, I'll figure out what and when to purchase. And you, if you don't want to lose your job, go and do your job," she said. Michael understood everything from the first time and decided that his work was more valuable to him. He never had another conversation like that again. It was impossible to change anything, and without his favorite department and patients he did not want to stay. And so he lived for some time, home, work, home again, until, returning one day, he heard a pitiful squeak or cry under the porch of the hospital. Looking in, he saw a small defenseless puppy licking its bloody paw. "Poor thing, how on earth did you get in here? And who did that to you?" "Well, let's go rescue you," Michael said. He took off his shirt and, spreading it out on the grass, carefully moved the puppy and wrapped it up. Michael picked the cub up, carried him home, and carefully examined and treated the wound, which was not very deep. He'd managed to bump into something sharp, probably a nail, and had probably been immobile for a long time. Michael cleaned up the grimy find, and a couple of days later he was greeted by the rescued Drushok, as he was called by his owner. Wagging his tail enthusiastically and jumping on his revived paw, the dog became a real outlet, someone for whom he wanted to come home again. Every evening and morning Michael tried to walk with Friend in the park, where the locals often walked their pets. He learned from one of them that Buddy was at the age when he needed a friend, and the neighbor advised, "Go to Central Park, I hope you know where that is. It's where the local dog breeders meet on weekends. We found a bride for our Sheikah there. Oh, you'll find all kinds of breeds and colors there. For your Druska, you'll definitely find someone." The park was just a couple of stops away, and Michael decided to go there the very next day after work, bringing his friend, to find out what was going on. As soon as he entered the open park gates, he immediately noticed a boy holding a small cardboard box. So the grandfather said, pulling a small flashlight out of his pocket. He began to illuminate the steps, and as he descended, he beckoned towards it. A less than cheerful sight appeared before Michael. There were rags strewn on some boards that looked like flight debris, among which a pair of feet was visible. He determined that a man was lying there. Ordering Buddy to sit down, he took the flashlight from Tom's hands and came closer. After carefully examining the grandfather, he turned to the boy and said, "Well, what can I say? Things are really bad, but not hopeless. We will try to save your grandfather. Now I'll take him to the hospital, and you stay here with Drushek. He will guard you, and you look after him while I leave. Promise you won't run away?" "I trust you with my pet." Calling a cab, Michael struggled to get his grandfather into the back seat and asked the driver to go to his clinic. He knew it was that time in their department when there were no vacancies in any of the rooms, but the VIP room that the superintendent kept for special people was definitely empty. Taking a wheelchair in the emergency room, he transferred the grandfather and immediately, under the surprised looks of the medical staff, took him to his ward. "Give me, please, the keys to our special room," he said to the nurse on duty. She looked in horror at the dirty, overgrown old man in a tattered sweater and the same pants. Then, as if coming to her senses, she whispered confusedly, "Michael will be killed tomorrow by the superintendent. He only settles there the elite and businessmen." He took the keys out of the girl's hands and calmly said, "And you, Lucy, say that I stole the key myself and did not ask anyone. Let me alone be punished. By the way, please ask Leslie. I think it's her shift today to help me clean up our patient a little." Leslie, an elderly orderly, oohing and ahhing, helped to make the patient look more or less decent. Michael then performed a more thorough re-examination. Having prescribed all the necessary medications, he put Grandpa's IV and decided to go home. Already leaving, he heard Lucy whispered to her colleagues, "Oh, Michael will get more tomorrow from the superintendent." I feel sorry for him. He realized it himself, but at that moment he decided not to think about it. It was late, and he still had to get Tom out of the basement. Michael had already made up his mind. He couldn't leave the boy alone in such a horrible place. They lay snuggled together in the same makeshift rookery where his grandfather had been moaning not so long ago. Michael's heart clenched with worry for the boy, but he tried to say in a calm voice, "Well, Tommy, I'm glad to tell you, your grandfather is settled in. We weren't so lucky though, but he's already under medical care. That's the most important thing. And you can't stay here alone. I certainly can't let that happen. So why don't you get up and come and sleep at my place? I'll make a quick trip to work in the morning and check on your grandfather. Then I'll leave you at the orphanage." It was obvious that the little boy was not very happy about this prospect, but he couldn't refuse his rescuer either. At home, Michael sent him straight to the shower, where the boy chattered and splashed happily with water for almost an hour. Among the things left after his wife left, he found his son's t-shirt and shorts, which fit the guest perfectly. After eating a whole plate of store-bought dumplings with gusto, Tom climbed out of the bathtub, flushed, and, looking sad, said, "Maybe I don't have to go to the orphanage tomorrow. You're living on your own. I can help you while grandfather is sick. I'll walk Druska, take out the garbage. I can even mop the floors." They made me do it a couple times at the orphanage as punishment. Michael's heart once again squeezed with worry for the baby, but, making a serious look, said, "Okay, we'll have a day to think about it. In the meantime, go to bed." The boy looked at him fearfully and immediately disappeared into the room where Tom's crib stood. The boy fell asleep almost instantly as soon as he touched the pillow, and slept, it seemed, without even moving until the morning. Having prepared breakfast, Michael fed his guest and, having taken a whole box of toys and books from the mezzanine, asked him not to be bored and went to work. He knew that nothing good awaited him in the ward, but he hoped that maybe somehow things would turn out all right. He heard Brian yelling. The superintendent was foaming at the mouth with indignation, shouting indignantly, addressing a nurse, who authorized the only VIP room to be turned into a bum ward. "Where am I supposed to put an honorable man now? Should I keep the businessman in the corridor, and this tramp in the best room on the ward? Now roll this old man out wherever you like, and have the ward sterile again in a minute." When he saw Michael enter the ward, the superintendent clenched his fists and strode toward him, coming right up to him. He gritted his teeth. "You're making decisions for me here. Well, I won't stand for it. You're fired. And take your old man out wherever you want. The room's clear." "Peter Samuel, it's you. I didn't recognize you at first. It's been years since I've seen you." Everyone stared in silent amazement as the well-known businessman, for whom the room was to be vacated, rushed to the grandfather, who was already being wheeled out on a gurney. "This is my favorite teacher, And not just a school teacher, but a wonderful teacher and an amazing person. If it wasn't for you, I probably wouldn't have gotten where I am." The businessman, who had been sitting with a disgruntled look a couple minutes ago, now looked quite happy and, without letting go of his grandfather's hand, was talking to him about something. To all who were watching, the scene was completely unexpected. Everyone watched, afraid to say even a word. The superintendent, amazed by this course of events, pretended that dismissal was out of the question. He even made Michael his grandfather's attending physician. Michael never made it to the orphanage that day. But the next day, because he had to go to work later, took Vanya to the orphanage, no matter how much he asked not to do it. Parting, he promised to come again. He decided to find out what was necessary for adoption. The principal, who met him at first very cordially, when she learned that Michael already had a son with whom he was deprived of communication, did not even listen to anything. Immediately her voice became harsh, and she looked at him sternly and said, "How did you even have the sense to talk about adoption? You left your son without a father. A normal parent is not deprived of communication with the child, and you're giving this poor guy hope. You know, besides hope, he needs love, a family, a real family. It's not a toy. Go, and I hope I never see you here again." Michael wasn't going to back down so easily and decided to ask for a chance to see the boy at least once in a while on weekends. But the principal thought for a while and gave up, adding, "He's going to run away anyway. So I think it's better to give your consent, only if you take it out of the territory. Please leave a written statement, as you should." They began to see each other almost every week. With Vanya went to Central Park, walked around the city, ate in a cafe his favorite banana ice cream. And Michael felt like a son with him, and the boy was very much looking forward to his appearance, happily ran to meet him. Every time he asked how Peter's grandfather was doing, and he was very worried about him. Grandpa's condition was getting better every day, and Michael talked about it. The businessman insisted that the single VIP room was made into a double room with a second bed, and he supported Peter Samuel in every way he could. One day Michael, coming in to check on the patients, found them engaged in a conversation from which he learned that his grandfather's only son had gone missing without a trace after leaving on a watch many years ago. Kate, my son's wife, is a real piece of work. She didn't hide her love affairs in front of him. And after he disappeared, she brought a lover into the house. So I spent a year behind bars, all tattooed. And the words are all prison jargon. This convict moved into our apartment. They started organizing drinks and parties every day, and then they threw me out like a useless thing. They also threatened me, saying that if I resented him, the bandit would kill me, as he said. So I didn't resist. Of course, I was ashamed to get out. That's why I offered to help, to carry and fetch things at the market or at the train station. Where to clean up. There in the Central Park, I met a nice full boy. I felt sorry for him, so I wanted to help him. We lived until I started to earn some money, and I put my pension into a savings book. Not for myself, I bequeathed all my old man's contribution to Adam, so that if I died, the boy would have something. He's got no one to help him. He's all alone, like me. You, Ben, say hello to them for me. Tell them Grandpa Peter is worried about him, the older man said. Michael smiled and, delighted with the story, replied, "Well, if things keep going at this rate, you, Peter Samuel, will soon see him for yourself. We'll have you ready for discharge in a week. And your neighbor, too, by the way. You're having a favorable effect on him. He must be ashamed to give up at such a young age, looking at you." The businessman smiled and immediately replied, "Yes, just since high school. I remember Peter Samuel teaching me not to get discouraged and not to give up no matter what happens in life. So that's what I'm trying to do, Jack." The businessman turned out to be a normal, simple man, and he and Michael even became friends. A couple of times, visiting his patients before going home, he could be stuck in their room for hours and remembered that it was time to leave, only when the nurse came in with a demand to turn off the lights and go to bed. Michael talked about his divorce from his wife and his ban on seeing his son, to which Peter Samuel's eyes glistened, and he, holding back tears, said, "Michael, maybe you could adopt someone since you've been weaned from yours. While I'm still alive, I'll do what I can to help." To tutor him, Michael then explained that he'd already tried, but the principal categorically refused to go for it. He could see his grandfather's chagrin. "For starters, Peter Samuel, I suggest you move in with me after you are discharged, until you make up your mind. Then we'll see what to do next." Michael tried to reassure the old man. He really felt for the poor patient and decided to help him as much as possible. It was probably the only thing he could do for him at that moment. The day before Peter Samuel was discharged, Michael walked home in high spirits. On the way, he stopped at the store, bought the necessary groceries and the non-local gingerbread that his grandfather loved so much. Then he froze outside the house when he saw the light in his kitchen window. After standing for a few minutes in confusion at the entrance, he still stepped forward. Barely opening the front door, he saw Emily sitting still in the same pose as when they talked about the divorce. Still holding the same teacup, she was nervously sliding the spoon across the table. It was as if it was still the same evening. Tom ran out of the room with a shout of joy and, hugging his father, whispered, "Dad, and I'm here for you forever. Mom said I'm going to live here with you now." Michael lowered his son to the floor in surprise, and asking him to play, went into the kitchen. Without saying hello, he immediately asked, "Is it true? Did you bring Tom to stay with me? Or do you expect to live here yourself?" But that will never happen. Emily, who had changed a lot since then, looking like a magazine cover girl with the same silicone-pumped lips, stretched them out like a duck and said, "Oh please, I beg you. I'm just starting out in life, you might say, and I remember the poverty I lived in like a terrible dream. Tom really will live with you for the time being. I've already taken care of all the legalities. You will quite legally raise him in the near future. My beloved Peter the Frenchman has invited me to move in with him." Then, changing her tone as if apologizing, she said, "You understand, new country, new place. I need to settle in a little, and then I'll get Tom." At that moment, Michael really wanted to tease, as if she would entrust the child to an alcoholic and a panic-stricken man. But he didn't escalate the situation, afraid that she would change her mind. Having made it clear that he understood everything and did not want to see her again, he turned around and went to his son. Emily did not wait long and, without even saying goodbye to her son, silently got up and left the apartment. Michael at that moment was shocked. How can you so easily trade a child for a life abroad, for a life with a strange man? But then, after thinking about it, he realized that now he was truly glad that she had made that decision. After all, it was something he had dreamed of for so long. Now he would be living together with his own son without having to wait for someone else's permission. "Well, Tom," he said cheerfully, picking his son up in his arms, "let's go make a bachelor supper. After all, we've got to learn to do everything on our own now." To which the boy, wrapping his arms around his father's neck and huddling close, whispered, "Dad, I missed you so much. I will always help you. Just don't put me in an orphanage. Mom said that if you don't take me, she'll give me up there, and I can even peel potatoes." Michael looked at his son fearfully and said, "Really? What orphanage? You have your daddy, so now we won't be lost. Especially you know how to peel potatoes. That's a lifesaver. We won't starve." That evening, after putting Tom to bed, Michael sat in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about how they would live their lives. In the end, he decided that there was nothing wrong with their future. It is only necessary to arrange a son in the nearest kindergarten. But until then, his salvation again agreed to be a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, whom he called the same evening. She resented the mother who had abandoned her son, but gladly agreed to help with Tom. That morning, leaving his son with her, Michael went to work, stopping by the daycare center on the way. There, they quickly helped formalize the boys' return to their facility. Michael went to work with peace of mind. Nothing major was scheduled for that day, and he asked the superintendent to leave early so that he could transport Peter Samuel to his home after he was discharged. Brian approached the surgeon and, shaking his hand, said, "Well done, respect. Not everyone would dare to help in a situation like that. And you, Tom, you even take him into your home. Although I heard that our businessman also offered him an apartment, but he refused." Michael thanked him for his praise, but he didn't fully believe his words. The boss was too quick to change his attitude toward people. In fact, Michael didn't care what other people thought. He felt for his grandfather with all his heart and was already sure that he had made the right decision. Peter Samuel found a common language with Tom on the first evening, and they became inseparable. His son was happy to fall asleep to the stories read to him by Grandpa Pete, and picking him up from daycare was like drawing lots. Every time the neighbor and Peter Samuel argued over who would go. In the end, they grumbled at each other, got dressed, and went together. Things seemed to be settling down, but Michael was still anxious to get Adam out of the orphanage. He had already taken him several times on weekends, and he and Tom played very friendly. Peter Samuel looked at them and said, "They really are like brothers. Look, they even look alike. Michael, maybe you can try again to talk to the principal to adopt the boy, well, or at least guardianship. I'm not as energized as I used to be, but I can still do a lot of things. I'll help you with these handsome boys." After all, more than 30 years of teaching experience is not in vain. Having decided to have a serious conversation, Michael one day again went to the orphanage, very much hoping for luck. But what was his surprise when he heard, "And you, my little dove, you're too late. Adam's been adopted and he's living in a fancy house," Michael asked, confused. "But that can't be. How did it happen so fast? You didn't even say anything about it." And Adam was just visiting, trying not to look her in the eye. The principal, as if apologizing, added, The boy will be better off there. Who are you? An ordinary doctor with a penny salary. And there's a famous businessman. He's friends with our mayor. How could we say no to him? And Adam was the one he wanted to hire. He wouldn't even look at anyone else as he left the orphanage. Michael sank down on the bench and couldn't believe that they would never see each other again. He didn't know how he was going to tell Peter Samuel. He couldn't understand why some businessman, a well-known personality in town, would want a kid from the orphanage. He tried to ask the principal who the celebrity was, but she flatly refused to say anything about this person. At dinner that evening, they had a long talk with Peter Samuel about what had happened, wishing they could bring Adam back, but not knowing where to begin. Then Grandpa, remembering something, asked for the phone and said how wonderful it was to have a good memory. Thank goodness I haven't imprinted yet, and I keep all the phone numbers of people I know in my head. I have one former student, a wonderful man, been on the police force for years. Maybe he can help. He made one call, and after a brief conversation on the phone, returned to the room, smiling. Grandpa reported that with difficulty, but he was able to get the student to find out who had adopted Adam, promising not to give him up in any way. A couple hours later, they already knew who it was and where he now lived. Michael, not wanting to wait, decided to look into everything, and, leaving his son with Peter Samuel, went to the specified address. The house of the businessman was in an elite country village under guard, and Michael had to resort to trickery, saying that he was a doctor called to a patient. At that moment, a small suitcase with medicines and other doctor's items, which he had brought from home, came in very handy, having thought up this backup plan just in case. It might not have worked out. The guard called the owner of the cottage, but at that moment he was distracted by someone on the radio, so he waved Michael off and walked towards the gate. The house where Adam now lived was one of the largest and stood out strongly from the neighbors. It looked like a fairy tale castle, with a bunch of small and medium-sized towers on different levels of the structure. Michael was afraid to even imagine how much it might all cost, but his musings were interrupted by a child's joyful cry. "Uncle Michael, it's so good of you to come. Please take me away from here. I want to go to Grandpa Peter's." The boy literally flew out of the expensive foreign car that pulled up to the house and rushed to Michael. He quickly picked him up in his arms and, holding him close to him, asked, "Hey, are you feeling bad here? Are you hurt?" But the kid didn't even have time to answer. A man who had come up to them snatched the boy from Michael's arms and, handing him to a woman who was hurrying out of the house, said sternly, "Mary Adamson, take the child and take him inside." "I'll be right with you," Adam, holding on with his last strength, stepped forward and looked at Michael with a sort of pleading look. But the master of the house immediately warned, "Don't you dare ever come near the boy again." "Who are you?" "I'm a doctor." "But that doesn't matter right now," Michael immediately replied. "I'm here to help Adam. I can see you didn't take him in good faith. Do you have some kind of purpose?" "I just can't see what you can get out of a little boy from an orphanage." The rich man laughed, and when he had calmed down, he said, "That's right then. And doctor, you now go from here, mind your own business, and once and for all forget the existence of this kid. Otherwise, I'm going to make your life a nightmare. Believe me, I have the money and influence to do that." Michael stepped closer and, looking straight into the eyes of the cocky rascal, said quietly but firmly, "You needn't frighten me. I have no power or money, but I can see that the boy is not well here, which means that I will do anything to take him away." Turning around, he walked down the road, just in time to hear the rich man start hurling threats at him. Back home, Michael told Peter Samuel about everything, and together they realized that Adam had to be rescued at any cost. Only realizing that the rich man would not give him up so easily, they decided to think the plan over carefully. True, the next day, coming to work, Michael realized that the scoundrel first began to press him, calling him to himself. The superintendent indignantly poked Michael in the face with incomprehensibly how appeared statements from patients. All complained about his negligence, unprofessionalism, and some patient even claimed that he had tried to molest her. "Bastard," Brian yelled at the whole ward. "Are you out of your mind? You're running a brothel for me. Now I understand why your wife left you. It's unbelievable. In all my years in medicine, this is the first time I've seen such a disgrace. You know I'm not the only one who's gotten these papers, right? And today we are waiting for a test of your professional competence." That same day after work, Michael waited at the cottage village of a rich man and, seeing his car, stood across the road. The one, hitting the brakes sharply, jumped out of the car and, grabbing Michael by the chest, yelled, "You idiot. Don't you understand normal language? Then don't you realize that I'll stop at nothing? I'll wipe you out." Michael shoved him away and shouted back, "You don't seem to understand. I'm not stopping either, and I'm going to save Adam at all costs. Just wait. I'll start by finding out why you want him in the first place. I can't believe there's a desire to make his life happy. You took him from the orphanage." The rich man got into the car and, slamming the door with all his might, drove off. Michael remained standing in the road, clenching his fists so tightly that they looked like they were about to burst. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew that Adam had to be rescued. Peter Samuel, having heard about his troubles at work and his trip to the rich man, promised to try to find out more information about this scoundrel. In the morning, as soon as Michael got to work and changed his clothes, the nurse told him that a lady was anxious to speak to him. Standing in the foyer was a beautiful woman in her mid-30s wearing an elegant suit. Her blonde hair fell in neat strands over her shoulders and seemed airy in the sunlight beating through the window. He stood as if mesmerized until he was brought back to reality by the stranger's voice. She smiled and, taking a step towards him, said, "Hello, Ben, you were recommended to me by Rick as a very good specialist. My dad needs your counseling." I'm willing to pay any money. She was ready to cry, and Michael, trying to calm down, offered to sit down. But as she took a step, the stranger twisted her foot, groaning awkwardly. It's okay, Michael replied with a smile. "It's all right. What's wrong with your leg?" But the beautiful woman somehow quickly scrambled up and, apologizing again, said she would bring her father back soon. She disappeared as quickly and unexpectedly as she had appeared. A policeman immediately appeared in her place. Then everything was as in a terrible dream. In the presence of witnesses, from the pocket of his robe was taken from the pocket of the envelope with cash, and the doctor was accused of taking a bribe. Michael, of course, guessed whose hands it was, but he couldn't believe in such meanness until the end. Only now he understood why the beauty had evaporated so quickly after she had stumbled. At that very moment she had discreetly dropped that ill-fated envelope to him, but proving anything in his case was useless. That same day he found himself in a cell where everyone was not the first day, and, it seems, not for the first time. As if expecting his arrival, the prisoners pounced like a pack of wild rabid beasts. At that moment Michael thought he was going to be killed, but at the most unexpected moment a hoarse voice came from a far corner. "Leave him alone. And you come over here, doctor. Were you the one who tried to save my boy? I didn't know anything myself until today. It's good that I got a message from Freedom. The orphanage teacher confessed that Adam was my son. I didn't know I had an heir." Then he told for a long time that the businessman who adopted Adam was his former companion. Allegedly, he did everything to take away the remaining business of the authority at large, but nothing was working. That scoundrel, he went on to say, when he found out about Adam, decided to play it up. "Why do you think he took the boy to himself? The bastard knew I'd do anything for my son. So he made a nasty move. Your efforts to save Adam are unknown. Thank you very much. Don't be afraid of anyone here. As long as I'm here, no one will hurt you anymore." Indeed, from that day on, the cellmates did not make any more attempts to harm him. His case progressed very slowly. But one day Peter Samuel was allowed to visit him. He said in a conspiratorial tone that he had managed to get a job as a janitor in a rich man's house, and somehow, when the owner was not at home, he had stolen the boy and taken him away. "But he could easily find you," Michael said indignantly. "Is it worth risking your life and the boy's life like that?" But Grandpa squinted slyly. A voice whispered, "Don't be afraid. I told you I have an apprentice on the police force. Anyway," he said, "there's a bunch of dirt on this rich guy, and he's about to replace you behind bars. The same apprentice found you a good lawyer. It's just a matter of time. You'll be free again. By the way, don't worry about the boys. Jack, your neighbor's got us staying at her cottage for a while. I took the 5:00 a.m. train from there, so it's fresh air, so to speak, cow's milk. And when everything subsides, we'll go back to town. You just hang in there back in his cell," Michael told Jack, Adam's father, and the man, looking at him gratefully, said, "We should talk later, when everyone's asleep, waiting until the cellmates had settled down." He asked him to listen, trying to speak as quietly as possible. Jack said, "Here's the thing. Mike, I don't have much time left to live. I didn't want to tell anyone this, but you'd think they'd take me to the hospital every time. I'm no good. I must have done something wrong. If God won't let me live, if he finds out about his son, he'll take care of him in Russia. Or, on the contrary, he's trying to save me from such a disgrace. After all, there's no telling what's better, a criminal father or no father at all." Seeing that Michael was trying to say something, he put his finger to his lips and, listening, continued, "Don't interrupt. It's hard enough having this conversation as it is. I see you are a rare, pure man. I'm a good judge of character. Here's a piece of paper with all 8 digits on it. You'd better memorize them. I don't know if they'll take it away or if you'll lose it. I'll give you the name of a bank in our city, where there's a fortune in this very box with this number. I beg you, make a man out of my son, take care of him, and a good education. For example, let him be a doctor somehow, or something else. But don't let him repeat my path. I trust you very much, doctor, and I hope to look up at you from above when I die. If Lad hasn't died, of course." He grinned sadly and patted Michael on the shoulder. He went to bed. That night, Michael never slept, first trying to make sense of what he had heard, and then worrying about how the boys would be without him. But knowing Mrs. Thompson for many years, he was sure that they would not go hungry. In just a few days, he was indeed released, and on arriving home, he was pleasantly surprised to see that the household had returned from the village. His aunt was fussing in the kitchen. The house smelled delicious borscht and pies. When he heard the door open, the boys who had been sitting next to Peter Samuel on the sofa with a book rushed out of their seats like a hurricane and flew into the hallway shouting hurrah. Papa Michael's back Drushok jumped out after them, wagging his tail happily and trying to lick his owner's face as he jumped up and down. Michael knelt down on his knees and pressed the boys against him, unable to hold back the tears of happiness running down his cheeks. That evening they all had dinner together. As much as the neighbor tried to leave them alone, yes, to have dinner with her family as well. "Why should I loom here?" she would say with embarrassment when Peter Samuel would gallantly pull back his chair and offer to join them. Michael, supporting his intention to keep his neighbor with them, smiled and said, "What on earth are you talking about? You are now to the boys instead of the birth grandmother they don't have." If you don't mind, of course, she only brushed it off with embarrassment, but stayed for dinner. At one point, Peter Samuel, rising quickly, turned up the sound of the television, and Michael heard the announcer pronounce a familiar name. It was a detailed account of the high-profile arrest of a well-known businessman in the city, with a long list of all his abuses and machinations. "Oh, my dear, he's had enough." Slapping himself on the knee, the old man grunted contentedly. "So, my respects to Michael. He brought this case to the end, not afraid of the scoundrel. Now he won't be free for years to come. Normal people will sleep and work in peace." In the evening, when they all cleared the table together, and Michael happily put the boys to bed, he decided to talk about the conversation with the authority with Peter Samuel. The latter listened to him silently, attentively. Then, after a moment's silence, he said, "I don't know what you think, but I don't think we ought to touch them yet. But there's little chance of their surviving. This comrade will still be demanding. We have enough to live on at home. I can withdraw part of my pension. I can do some tutoring while the boys are in daycare." Michael thought for a moment. Perhaps his grandfather was right, and he decided to start by filing for guardianship of them. Surprisingly, the head of the department, as if feeling some guilt, when she heard from someone on the staff that he had been released, called him herself and invited him back to work. Even gave an excellent character reference to submit to the guardianship authorities. After returning to work, Michael began to forget about the conversation with the authority figure about the money left behind, when one day he received a call from a man asking to meet at the appointed time in the park near the hospital. A man was waiting for him, who immediately handed him a sheet folded several times. "Dragon gave his soul the other day without looking at Michael," he began. "He asked me to find you and give you the last word. Yes, this is for you," handing over the sheet. He silently got up and left, and Michael remained seated on the bench, holding the message in his hands. He remembered that Greg, Adam's father, had been called Dragon in prison, and realized it was a note from him. When he unfolded it, he read that even behind bars, Greg knew that the boy had stayed with him, and that he was going to take custody of him. His father asked him to raise him into a decent man, and to use all the money for a good cause. Michael realized that no matter how much was left in the box, he would keep his promise to Greg and raise Adam as if he were his own son, and he couldn't even imagine the sums involved. Michael hesitated to visit the bank for several days, but as soon as he learned that he had been granted custody of Adam, he decided to open the safe deposit box. After consulting with Peter Samuel, they decided to open an account in the boy's name, and if there was some money left, Michael dreamed of opening his own doctor's office, where he could give advice. However, on this, Peter Samuel sadly remarked, "What kind of consultations? Mike, you are a surgeon from God. You should have your own clinic. Another thing, you have to operate. You cannot do without it." Michael, on the one hand, agreed. Without surgery, he could not imagine life, but realizing how much such a clinic may cost, immediately abandoned the idea. What was his surprise when, opening a safe deposit box in the bank, he found a sum many times larger than what he could only think of. Taking all the contents, he clutched the bag to his chest and went home in fear. After putting the children to bed, he and Peter Samuel counted everything several times and sat silently looking at each other. Grandpa was the first to speak. How much money? Not just a clinic, but half the city, if not the whole city, could be bought with it. Weighing all the pros and cons, they decided to entrust part of the money to the bank, leaving it in a safe deposit box, and to open an account in Adam's name. But remembering Greg's request to let the money for a good cause, Michael decided to open his clinic, dreaming that in years to come, when the boys will be older, at least one of them will follow in his footsteps. As if by fate, he accidentally from the same Mrs. Thompson learned that in a nearby neighborhood put up for sale hospital, in which she worked as a check room attendant. Having once again made the boys cakes, she shared them over tea. Can you imagine? Our landlord was a great specialist, a very clever man. He worked all his life in medicine, built this clinic from scratch, but could not save himself. A clot broke off and he died instantly. His kids are far from medicine, so they decided to sell their father's hard-won brainchild. If you had one of these, Michael, you'd probably have tons of people coming to see you. Notice how the men looked at each other. She added, "Am I wrong? Everyone is talking about us, that our Ben with golden hands, and decided not to say anything to anyone for the time being." Michael took a leave of absence from work and was fully immersed in the design of the clinic. This time he again thanked fate that he had Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Peter, as the boys called them, who had already become completely family in his house. The arrangements had been very quick without delay. It took Michael a long time to sort out the affairs of the clinic. One thing was good, most of the staff remained unchanged and was a very well-coordinated team. And those couple of people who did not want to work with the new manager left painlessly. Almost immediately, new applicants responded to the vacancies. And what was Michael's surprise when he saw some familiar cute faces at the interview? "Lucy, no way. How on earth did Brian let you go?" he said enthusiastically when he saw his former co-worker. Lucy lowered her eyes and quietly replied, "And I didn't say I was leaving to join you. I just quit, that's all. So if you don't hire me, I'll be officially unemployed." Michael laughed and said with a squint, "You're a blackmailer, Lucy." Although how could I turn down a job for the best nurse in the surgical department? They both laughed. And from the next day, Lucy already worked under the guidance of his ideal, which from the first day of acquaintance idolized. Michael's business was picking up pretty quickly. He turned out to be not only an excellent surgeon, but also a fair and competent manager. The clinic soon gained a new fame in the city. It was the only private medical institution that treated the needy pensioners free of charge, without charging them a dime. Michael began to notice how much Lucy cared for him, and for the first time he thought that it was such a quiet and modest woman that he would dream of seeing as the mother of his sons. "Lucy, how would you like to go for a walk in Central Park on the weekend? Only I won't be alone, but with my two sons." She looked at him enthusiastically and nodded her head as if she'd been looking forward to it all her life. The day they all spent together was unforgettable. The boys had fallen in love with Lucy from the first moment and did not want to let her go. Only after the promise that she would come to visit them the very next day, they calmed down. "Well then, we'll have dinner tomorrow," Michael said as he walked her to the driveway. All night he analyzed the previous day and caught himself thinking that for the first time he felt completely happy. All day he'd been unable to find a place to be, afraid to admit that for the first time in a while his heart was trembling, and he wished Lucy were always there for him. With Peter Samuel, he talked about something. In the kitchen, he helped prepare treats for his guest. Michael had noticed more than once that they looked like a couple in love, but he was afraid to jinx it. "Peter, keep an eye on the boys," he called out into the kitchen. Returning some time later with a huge bouquet, Michael sat down thoughtfully on the couch and felt Peter Samuel's hand on his shoulder. "That, son, is the right thing to do. No boy should be without a woman's care, affection, and love. Mature at last. Don't worry. That feeling never hurt. Trust me, old man." At dinner, from the very beginning, only the boys behaved liberally. They tried to tell Lucy the big news of the day. "Our friend's a daddy," Adam shouted excitedly. Tom interrupted him, grabbing Lucy's laughing hand and telling her conspiratorially, "Daddy said there were several puppies born at once, and if we behave, he'll get us another one." Waiting until the boys had finished talking, Michael stood up and walked over to Lucy, holding out a small velvet box. In a voice trembling with excitement, he said, "Lucy, I realize this may be too quick and unexpected for you, but I've just now realized what a fool I've been all this time, not noticing what a beautiful woman I have by my side. Please marry me. If you refuse, I will understand." There was such silence that it seemed that even if a mosquito or a fly flew by, one could hear their breathing. After a moment's silence, Lucy said, almost in a whisper, "I agree. Of course you do." What a start. The boys jumped up and down as if on a spring, and then pounced on Lucy from both sides, shouting with one voice, "Yay, we have Lucy's mom now." Michael stared at her in confusion, unable to believe his happiness. Then he came over and gave her a hug, Thank you. I promise you won't regret it. Suddenly the neighbor, placing her wrinkled palm on Peter Samuel's hand, said embarrassedly, "There, now I can accept your offer, unless of course you've forgotten and changed your mind." Peter Samuel looked at her with a loving look, and kissing her hand, replied affectionately, "How could I? I'll never give you up. And you'll just have to put up with the way you are." Adam whispered something in his brother's ear, and they giggled again and began to shout, "Teely, teely, 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 teely." Two brides and grooms, everyone laughed at their dalliance for a long time, and it seemed impossible to find happier people on the whole globe that evening than in this small but love-filled apartment. Waking up in a junkyard, the rich girl heard the dialogue of foreigners, and after learning about the inheritance, she pretended to be dead. "Hello, this is John and a new author story on my channel." It doesn't work like that. The light of day and bright light struggled to shine through the gaps in the old car tires stacked in a carelessly chaotic pile. Nancy wrinkled her nose. Her head was splitting and her mouth was dry, so dry her tongue seemed to stick to it. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't listen. Her muscles spasmed painfully. Where? How did she get here? Trying to remember anything but the excruciating headache was futile. The memories seemed to dissolve into a thick fog, leaving a void. Nancy looked around and could hardly believe she was in such a place. She was surrounded by piles of trash, rusty barrels, a couple of collapsed TVs from a bygone era, scraps of clothing and empty bottles scattered around the seated Cody. At that moment, she looked closer and made out two silhouettes standing by a pile of old tires. Rising on her elbows with difficulty, Nancy listened. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but the voices sounded familiar, with a slight foreign accent. "Need to be dealt with as soon as possible," one said. His voice was deep and velvety. "Papers. The inheritance. I suspect George has managed to hide everything," the other replied in a melodic and calm voice. Nancy shuddered. The words she heard caught her. Inheritance papers in their country? She tried again to rise to her feet, but they refused to listen to her. Rising to all fours, Nancy slowly made her way toward the pile of tires. The strangers stood with their backs to her. Their silhouettes, illuminated by the sun's rays, seemed intimidating. She lurched. Her heart pounded frantically in her chest. What had happened? Who were these people? How had she ended up here? "No need to take any chances," the man with the velvet voice said. "We need to find someone to contest the will." "It's worth researching first," the other continued, and his voice was determined to investigate. Nastina was sure exactly what they were discussing, but the word investigate made her wince. She recalled vague images flashing through her mind. Running, deafening noise, bright lights, and then emptiness. Nancy sat huddled against the tires and pondered. The whole situation seemed absurd. The inheritance. Someone had hidden the papers. What kind of nonsense was this? "We have to be careful. We've done enough damage lately," the man with the velvet voice interrupted her musings. "Don't worry. I've thought of everything," the other replied. Nancy turned pale. A clear but eerie thought suddenly flashed through her mind. They don't just want to find the documents, they want to find her. She didn't know why she had decided that, but her intuition was telling her. This situation is very dangerous. Nancy glanced at the pile of trash where old boards were lying around and hastily began to gather them to build herself a shelter. "I can't," she heard a voice that sounded closer than before. "I can't wait so long." She froze. The men were already very close. Nancy quickly scrambled away from the boards and pressed herself against the ground, trying to blend in with the debris. She held her breath. Her heart was pounding in her chest as if it wanted to burst out. "You can't leave her alive," the man continued. "Oh, come on," the amount she took was enough to permanently block her memory. "Believe me, she's safer now than ever." Nancy had no idea what these men were going to do to her, but she knew one thing: this was all very dangerous, and she needed to save herself. The girl looked at the pile of trash, then her gaze stopped on an old rusty barrel. She didn't know if there was trash in it or not, but she still decided to hide. "Don't worry, she's safe now," she heard the last words of the men before they passed her hiding place. Nancy took a deep breath and lay down on the trash-strewn floor, maintaining her natural pose. The foreigners moved closer, stood for a moment, and then one of them shined a flashlight beam in her face. "Why don't you check the policy?" one of them asked in his native tongue. "Oh, come on, I don't want to get my hands dirty. I'm ready." "I can see that," replied the other squeamishly. And Nancy lay there in the dark and damp, listening for their next steps. Nancy didn't know how much time passed before she decided to come out from behind the barrel. The sun was already setting. The sky was draped with coarse clouds. Nancy walked over to the pile of trash, looking around. The strangers were nowhere to be seen. She took a few steps forward and found herself near old wooden booths that looked more like abandoned shacks. Nancy saw a fire burning in a small iron stove in one of the booths. She cautiously moved closer and peered inside. There sat an old man in a dirty jacket. His feet were wrapped in a blanket, and he was staring at the flames. "Hello," Nancy said. The old man raised his head and looked at her. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "IA." Nancy, she suddenly stopped talking, not knowing what to say. She didn't remember how she had gotten to the junkyard. The old man did not hurry her. He continued to look at her with unchanging calmness. "Lost, I suppose?" he asked after a while. "I don't know," Nancy answered. "I don't remember." The old man sighed and took a large cast-iron pot off the stove. "Come here," he said, "and warm yourself." Nancy went to the stove and sat down on a small stool. The master poured water into the pot and put it on the fire. "You're freezing," he said, looking at her. "You must get warm." Nancy nodded and looked at the flames. The fire was crackling, casting a shadow on the walls of the booth. Nancy, wrapped in a thin sweater, tried not to look at the old tramp. She was uncomfortable with the sight of this strange, stern man. His reticence made it seem as if he knew more than he was saying. "My name is Mark Stevenson," he said at last, breaking the long silence. "Nancy Roberts," the girl whispered. Mark Stevenson nodded. "Nancy," he repeated thoughtfully. "It's a beautiful name." She shrugged and tried to get comfortable in the chair, which creaked menacingly beneath her. "What are you doing at the dump, anyway?" the old man asked. She didn't know what to say. She didn't remember how she'd gotten here, didn't remember where it had all started. And all she could remember was feeling panicked, feeling threatened, and running away. "I don't know. I really don't know," Nancy whispered. "It happens," the host said and turned to her. The tramp's gaze was intense and penetrating. He paused for a moment, as if searching for words. "I myself," he began, almost in a whisper, "have already forgotten much of my life." Stevenson stood up, walked over to a dusty shelf where rusty tools lay and old photographs in yellowed frames stood. He took one of them, rubbed it with his sleeve. "Here," he said, holding out the picture. "This is me in my youth." The photograph showed a young, trim man in a military uniform. He was smiling as he held the hand of Nancy, a pretty stranger. "That's my wife," Catherine, Mark Stevenson continued, as if talking to himself. "It was all right. I was a pilot in the sky." And then he stopped talking, as if in pain. "Then I was written off in the reserves for health reasons. I couldn't do without the sky, without freedom." Stevenson looked at Nancy, and there was a deep sadness in his eyes, but not despair. "I was bored at home. On Earth I became ill at ease, not like I used to be. Catherine was tired of me. She wanted happiness, and I didn't know what I wanted. It was like living happily ever after. George was growing up." Mark Stevenson was silent again. His face was frozen in a sad expression. "And then the disease took her. It was a tricky one. Sold everything, gave the last of it to save her somewhere. My son Johnny went to prison." Mark Stevenson took a glass of water from the table and drank it in big gulps. "I tried to save him, of course. I hired a good lawyer to get Johnny out on parole as soon as possible. But then these men came to my house in this big SUV, and they took the house away from me because his mom lost it in a gambling game. My Johnny put my dad's house on the line. They took everything away from me. I'm left in a landfill with a mountain of garbage." Stevenson grinned. "Sad and hopeless. I'm glad I found this hut at least, and it had a whole oven in it. They say he used to keep watch. What's there to keep watch over now?" "What about your son?" Nancy asked, feeling a wave of sympathy for the old man who had been so cruelly sidelined by life. "I don't know," honey Mark Stevenson answered. Despair flashed in his eyes again. "I got my last letter from him 2 years ago." He looked at the calendar on the wall, dark with soot stains. "That's 2 years," he whispered, as if talking to himself. Nancy put her hand gently on his shoulder. She didn't know how to comfort him, but she wanted to show him she was there for him. "Don't worry," she said. "Everything will be all right." Mark Stevenson smiled sadly. "Thank you," he said. He looked up again and looked at the calendar. "It's getting late," he said. "Come on, I'll make up your bed. There's a spot in the corner." He got up and led Nancy to a corner of the cabin, where old mattresses and blankets lay on wooden bunks. "Lie down," he said. "The morning is wiser in the evening. Where will you go at night now? No money, no papers." Nancy lay down on the mattress and tangled herself in the blankets. Despite her fatigue, she couldn't sleep. She thought about Mark Stevenson, about his life of loneliness. She also thought about her own fate and the secret she couldn't remember. "Don't be afraid," Mark Stevenson whispered from the darkness. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the sense of danger she had felt from the start still did not let her go. She still remembered her name, but where she was now, who she was, and what her place in society was, she didn't understand. She didn't look like a girl. Her manicure was well groomed, though her hands were dirty. Clothes, too, could not say anything definite. They were all dirty, with fresh holes in some places, as if they'd been dragged on the ground. "What happened to me?" she asked herself in a whisper, looking up at the ceiling covered in black soot. "Why can't I remember anything?" Suddenly, scraps of images flashed through her mind: the countryside, the grove, the berry bushes, and Grandma Claire Johnson. "The tumor," Nancy whispered. "Well, of course." At that moment, the girl clearly smelled the odor of pine resin and the taste of ripe, sweet blueberries. The image of her grandmother came back to remind her wrinkles, the grid of deep, fate-carved lines on her face. Claire had taught her to distinguish edible mushrooms from poisonous ones, showed her how to weave wreaths of wildflowers, and told her stories of the forest spirits she said lived in every tree and bush. A picture flashed through Nancy's mind. There she was, a little girl in a red dress with white ruffles, chasing a butterfly through a meadow strewn with daisies. Next to her, smiling, is Grandma Claire, picking strawberries in a basket. Unfortunately, the creaking of the old cabin in the wind, the rustling behind the wall, and the grumbling of old Mark Stevenson drowned out the memories, preventing them from taking clear shape. She remembered picking mushrooms with her grandmother, and Claire Johnson had always said, "Take your time. The mushrooms aren't going anywhere." "Take your time," Nancy Grandma's voice whispered in her mind. And suddenly a scene flashed clear as a sunny day in her mind. She was no more than 10 years old. She was walking through the woods to get mushrooms. "Grandma, I'm going to walk a little more," she asked. "I'll see what else grows there." "Okay, but don't go too far," Claire Johnson asked. Nancy nodded and went in search of trophies. Step by step, fungus by fungus. Before she knew it, she was deep in the woods. All she wanted was to find the biggest, most beautiful mushroom in the world. The sun's rays, breaking through the foliage, drew fanciful patterns on the ground. Suddenly, little Nancy heard the cracking of twigs behind her back and felt a sharp, unpleasant odor. Looking around, the girl saw him, a wild boar. Huge and formidable, he stood a few meters away from her. Head down and panting, the boar seemed ready to attack. Nancy's legs gave out and panic gripped her heart. She looked around quickly. A tall pine tree grew nearby. Nancy had no doubt that the boar could climb the tree. But in this situation, every second mattered. She quickly ran up to the pine and climbed up onto the highest branch, pressing herself against the trunk. "Stay back," shouted the girl to the boar. But it only grunted and began to rub against the tree as if trying to climb up. Nancy sat on the branch like a bird in a nest and watched the beast. She felt fear, but something else was awakening in her, a strength she had never felt before. The boar came to the tree, stomping the ground with its hooves, trying to reach her. Nancy, trembling with fear, clung tightly to the branches, looking up at the beast's muzzle glistening in the sunlight. "Don't do it," she whispered, looking at the boar. The girl sat in the tree, gripped by an eerie fear, for at least an hour. The sun was setting, the forest was getting dark and cold. She was already desperate, thinking she would stay here, when she heard a voice. Andy Parker, a gamekeeper passing by, heard the grunting of a wild boar. He approached a tree and spotted her. The man fired a shot in the air, chased the beast away, and the girl, roaring with fear and joy, finally climbed down to the ground. Nancy remembered the incident for a long time. It was a reminder to her of the fragility of life and the fact that even in the calmest place there can be danger. When she thought back to her childhood, she felt her heart fill with warmth and light. But in that warm light, like a shadow, loomed another, long-gone reality. Once her parents George and Anne, tired of desperate poverty, decided to go into business for themselves. They sewed overalls, the kind worn by workers building new homes, factories and roads, and then sold them. Nancy remembered helping her mother color the fabric as a child, and watched with bated breath as her father worked wonders on the sewing machine, turning pieces of fabric into protective suits. Lying on the stiff homemade couch, she remembered another incident involving her parents. She had been 8 at the time. She and her mom had gone to the store. In the children's department, among the various goods, Nancy noticed a beautiful doll with blue eyes and pink bows. She asked her mom to buy one, but she refused, citing that they needed to save money because they had a lot of debt. Nancy was upset, of course, but her mom promised to buy her a doll later. But she never got a toy. And that incident is forever etched in her memory. Nancy, tangled in an old woolen blanket, lay on the hard couch, tears slowly rolling down her cheeks. She still remembered Daddy proudly showing her the first costumes he and Mommy had made, as if they were cloth toys. They were lying on a cot in their small apartment, fulfilling a dream. "Look, Nancy," George said, hugging his daughter. "This is our future." Anne smiled, stroking her husband's arm. There was a spark of hope in her eyes. Nancy smiled too, but couldn't take her eyes off the pile of costumes, as if expecting those were about to come to life. Since then, life had been a whirlwind. My parents worked non-stop. Orders poured in one after another. A second machine appeared in their small apartment, then a third, then a fourth. Nancy couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her father without a sewing machine. He had become like a robot, putting all his thoughts and energies into the business. "When do we get a vacation?" Nancy asked. Once, tired of the constant hustle and bustle, Anne sighed, stroking her daughter's head. "Soon," she answered. "Soon we'll have enough money, and we'll live in a big house with a big garden, and you'll be able to play all day long." Nancy wanted to believe it, but doubts gnawed at her from within. She saw how hard it was for her mother. She was getting sick a lot, but she kept working. Early one morning, Nancy woke up to a strange noise. She went out of the room and saw her mother lying on the floor, clutching her chest. "Mommy, Mommy," she shouted, rushing to her for Kosheliva. Nancy looked at her daughter with unseeing eyes. An ambulance had been called. "Honey," she whispered, "don't be afraid." Although the doctors came quickly and helped her, it was too late. Her mom died in the hospital before she could live the happy life she'd dreamed of. Nancy was left with her father and grandmother. George Williamson withdrew into himself, didn't talk, didn't smile. He just worked and worked and worked, as if he wanted to forget the pain that was eating away at him from the inside. One day Claire Johnson suggested that Nancy go to a fortune teller. "Let's go to Agafia Fedorovna," said Grandma, holding in her hand a small icon. "It's worth a lot. She will help us for sure." Nancy didn't want to go there, but Grandmother insisted. They came to a small wooden hut on the outskirts of the village. It was dark and stuffy. A candle was burning on the table. Across from her sat an elderly woman with gray hair gathered in a bundle. "Hello," Nancy whispered, not taking her eyes off the fortune teller. "Hello, my dear," replied Grandma Agafia. "I know why I've come. Your mother didn't die of her own accord. From greed. She wanted to earn a lot of money, but she couldn't find happiness. And what will happen to us now?" "Will it be hard?" Nancy asked. "It's going to be hard," the fortune teller replied. "But you'll get through it. Just remember, Nancy, never trust strangers, especially those who speak a different language. They will bring trouble with them." Nancy looked at her grandmother and nodded, not knowing what was happening. Agafia shook her head and, breaking into a cough, extinguished the candle, letting the guests know that the reception was over. Nancy ran out of the hut, devastated and frightened. Deep down, she didn't believe in the words of some schoolgirl fortune teller, but she couldn't shake off the fear she felt. A few days later, she was sitting in her room reading a book. Raindrops were pounding on the window. Daddy was working in the workshop, as always. On the table was a black framed picture of Mommy. Nancy took it in her hands and ran her fingers lightly over her face, as if wiping away invisible tears. "Mommy," she whispered, "I'll never forget you." Days stretched on, each one similar to the last. George Williamson also worked tirelessly, and Grandma spent her time caring for Nancy and reminiscing about what Anne had been like. The girl tried not to think about the loss, and did what brought her peace of mind, helped her grandmother in the household, read books, walked in the woods, picking mushrooms and berries. Sometimes she remembered the words of fortune teller Agatha Ferguson, but tried to push away the anxiety. 6 months after these events, George Williamson was called at night into town, where he rented a room and opened a tailoring shop. The city greeted them with noise, the smell of exhaust fumes, and a fog that enveloped everything around them. Nancy looked around in surprise and could not believe her eyes. In the village, life flowed leisurely. Everyone knew each other. The whole village was like a single organism. But here life was boiling, bustling. Everyone was in a hurry to get somewhere, not noticing the people around them. "What do you think, Nancy?" asked her father, stopping the car at the entrance of an apartment building. Nancy shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know what to say." "I don't know," she whispered. "You'll get used to it," he replied, putting his arm around her shoulders and helping her out of the car. There were many rooms in the apartment, but they were all empty, cold, uninhabited. Her father had taken a place on the top floor on purpose, to be away from the hustle and bustle. "We'll be fine here," he said, walking into the living room and sitting down on the couch. Nancy looked around. She didn't like this apartment. It was gloomy, empty, cold. "Where's my room?" she asked. "Room? You have two," replied her father, smiling. "One for resting, the other for studying." "Good, I'm happy with that," she replied. Dad went into the kitchen to make tea, and off to school Nancy went. After a few days, she was very awkward and at the same time curious. There were many children of her age at school, and everyone was different, not like in the village, dressed in fancy clothes, but laughing and joking a little. Nancy felt like a stranger. "Hi, I'm Nancy," she said, walking up to a girl with long hair who was sitting alone on a bench outside the school. "Hi, I'm Catherine," the girl replied, smiling. "Do you go to this school too?" "Yes," the girl replied. "I'm in 5th grade." "Oh, me too," cool Nancy replied. "Do you want to go to the cafeteria across the street with me?" "Come on," Catherine replied. In the cafeteria, Nancy had her first taste of pizza. "So delicious," said the girl, smiling. "The pizza here is really great," Catherine agreed. After lunch, they went to class. As it turned out, they were in the same class. Nancy sat at the last desk. She was uncomfortable sitting alone. "Can I come with you?" she asked Catherine, who was in the first desk. "Sure," she agreed. From then on, Nancy had a friend in town. Daddy was already working without a day off. He was making a lot of money, but he was still often sad. Probably couldn't get over the death of his wife. And the thought that it all happened because of money did not give him peace. Time flew by. Nancy was quickly getting used to the new place. She liked school. The lessons were easy. And Catherine, with whom she became friends, always helped her to understand. In addition, Catherine often shared with Nancy news about fashion trends, helped her to choose clothes and even cosmetics. Gradually, Nancy turned into a stylish, fashionable girl. She no longer felt like a white crow at school. With grades, too, all was well. She studied for B's and A's and had a good relationship with her classmates. Catherine was her best friend. They went to the movies together, walked in the park, shared their secrets with each other. Nancy felt perfectly happy, but sometimes she noticed that Daddy was becoming more and more withdrawn. He talked to her less and less, and more often sat in his room, immersed in thought. Nancy realized that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. "Dad, why are you so sad?" she asked one evening as they sat at the table. "Oh, nothing much," the man replied. "Just tired of work, I guess." "Of it itself," replied George. Nancy could see that her father was not telling her something. She knew that it was not the work that made him sad, but something else. But what was it? "Dad, can you tell me what's wrong? Maybe something hurts." "Oh, nothing hurts," Dad replied, "just standing on the wall." Nancy persisted in asking what hurt. Finally, her father couldn't take it anymore. "It's all because of Mom," he confessed. "I can't forgive myself for her leaving. I know her life was taken by illness, but I can't understand why she didn't go to the doctors. I think she didn't want to spend money on treatment. She was decent honest. She was also afraid of being a burden. I know my mom meant well, but she didn't have to do that. I would have given anything for her health." "Dad, it wasn't your fault," Nancy said. "You did the best you could, didn't you?" "No, it's exactly my fault," George replied. "I shouldn't have worked so hard and given so little time to my family. But don't be sad. It's all gone now. You can't bring back the past. You can only move on and try to be happy," objected the daughter. "You're right," Nancy replied the father. "I'll try." "I love you, Dad," she said. "I love you too," George replied and hugged her. But his daughter felt sorry for him, the same sadness still in his eyes. Time flew by. Nancy graduated from high school with honors and entered the university. She chose journalism as her major. She also studied foreign languages for personal development. Frankly speaking, she always liked writing and dreamed of becoming a famous writer. New friends and new interests appeared at the university. She participated in student competitions, wrote articles for the newspaper, and became famous in university circles. But sometimes Nancy still felt lonely. She missed her father. George still worked weekends and had little time for her. Nancy called him often, but he said he didn't have time. Dad complained that he had a lot of work to do and said he'd be here soon, but he never did. And then Dad had a woman of fatal beauty, Natasha, who came from abroad to his homeland about a year and a half ago. And it was as if Dad was replaced, like a man of age, but fell in love like a boy. Natasha was only 10 years older than Nancy. It's not for nothing they say, a graybeard is a graybeard. A graybeard is a graybeard. The wedding of George and Natasha was solemn and colorful. The groom, who was not old enough, was happy, literally glowing with joy. Natasha was wearing a spectacular dress of champagne color, which gracefully encircled the figure, a slender figure. She had long black hair, a beautiful oval face, and clear blue eyes. Deep down, Nancy was happy for her father. Natasha's relatives from abroad came to the wedding. They communicated in their own language, but Nancy understood them and tried to participate in the conversation. "Nancy, how do you like my relatives?" Natasha asked her in a strange way. "Very nice," Nancy replied. "But I don't speak German very well." "Don't worry," Natasha replied, "I'll translate." The guests danced to live music, drank champagne, and partied. George Williamson was happy and felt young and strong again. He was ready for a new life, a new chapter in his story. "Nancy," she turned to her daughter. "Thank you for coming. I'm so glad you're here." "I'll always be here for you, Daddy," Nancy replied. "You know that. I love you very much." "And you, too," Nancy replied and hugged him. At that moment, she thought he had finally shed the weight of sadness and pain left behind by his mom's passing. After the wedding, George and Natasha moved into a beautiful house on the outskirts of town. They had a large garden, a swimming pool, but unfortunately his father was never able to give up his endless work, and therefore still as little time to spend with his family. Nancy understood that her father had a lot of things to do, and she knew that sometimes he couldn't just drop everything and come over. But still, she was sad. She wished Dad would just call and talk to her. Nancy tried not to dwell on how lonely she felt. Trying to find solace, she went to her studies. Student life was full of events, lectures, seminars, internships, meetings with the student creative group, concerts, theater productions. Sometimes Nancy really forgot that she was alone, especially when a friend appeared. His name was Sydney. He was a few years older than Nancy, but they shared a common passion for literature. "It's strange," Sydney once told her. "You write so beautifully, but all the time with a kind of sadness." "But everyone has a little sadness," Nancy replied. "Everyone has their own reasons." "But you're doing fine," said the boy. "Not really," she replied. "I had a mom, but now she's gone." "I'm sorry," Sydney said. "Let me help you finish your story." "You're very kind, but I don't want to hurt Daddy. I still hope he'll make time for me." "Don't be so naive," Sydney said. "You're an adult." "I know he's busy. I just miss his attention." "I understand that. But you don't have to let him play games with you," he said. "What do you mean?" Nancy blurted out. "I mean you should fight for your place in his life." "I don't want to fight. I love him." "Or do you think he's forgotten me?" "I don't know. Your father is very busy, and he must have forgotten that he has a daughter." "Don't say that. Please," the girl took offense. "I'm sorry, I don't want to offend you." "I understand you." Sydney corrected himself. "Thank you, Nancy. I want to tell you this. You're very smart, very beautiful, very talented, and I really like you." Sydney began stammering. She didn't know what to say. He was a good friend whom she respected, but at this moment she couldn't yet reciprocate his feelings. "I'm sorry, Sid, I'm not ready for a relationship yet," she said. "I understand," the guy said, "but I will wait." "You don't have to," she said. "Let's just stay friends." "Okay," Sydney said, "but I'll still be waiting." Nancy said goodbye and went to her dormitory. She was bitter that she had never been able to reciprocate his feelings. Deep down, she didn't want to build a relationship until she realized what was going on in her life. Nancy went to her room and made some entries in her journal, writing about her sadness, her father Sydney, and her dreams. Then in the evening, she sat in her room and read a book. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Daddy. "Nancy," he said, "I want to see you." "Daddy, where have you been?" "On another business trip," she exclaimed. "I'm in town," said George Williamson. "I'll come to see you tomorrow." "Why not today?" "A lot of things to do. My daughter's growing up." Nancy was very happy. She knew her father loved her, but he just had a lot of work to do. The next day, her father came and brought her flowers. "I'm so glad to see you," said George Williamson. "It's good to see you too," Nancy replied. They sat down at the table, and the father talked about his work, about his plans. "I want you to know that I love you very much," he said. "And I love you very much," Nancy replied. Her father sat for a while longer and then left. As he did so, Nancy again noted the sadness and disappointment in his eyes. George Williamson's new wife was not at all like his first wife and increasingly focused on his business and income. Nancy continued to study, but her thoughts increasingly turned to her father George, who seemed unhappy in his marriage. George devoted himself entirely to his work, and his new wife Natalie had become a nightmare for Nancy in a matter of months. She did everything she could to make her stepdaughter feel uncomfortable in her own home. "You better not waste your time with that silly writing stuff," Natalie declared at every opportunity. "You'd better pay more attention to your domestic duties. After all, you're not a little girl anymore. How are you going to support yourself if you're going to wallow in poverty? If I were you, I'd look for a rich groom. By the way, how do you like my new dress? I bought it in Paris. The stores there are wonderful. If you didn't waste your time on useless things, you could afford such purchases too." Nancy listened patiently to all the barbs, trying to ignore her stepmother's rudeness. "I know you can't understand me, but I won't give up. I will study, and I will get my way," Nancy answered. And she really didn't give up. Nancy studied hard, wrote stories and articles, and gradually her talent began to bear fruit. Soon she published her first story in the newspaper. Nancy was very pleased that her work was appreciated. She began to write and publish more often in various publications, and received an award for the best literary creative projects. However, her joy was overshadowed by thoughts of her father. Seeing that he was not in good health, Nancy was very worried, but her father denied the problems in every possible way. "Don't worry, daughter," he would say over the phone. "I'm doing fine, I'm strong and healthy. And you don't forget to study. Finish university. I love you very much." Nancy, however, saw that her father was tired, coughing more often, having painful attacks, and complaining constantly of headaches. One day she came to visit him and saw that he was no longer able to handle his daily chores. "Daddy, what's wrong with you?" Nancy asked anxiously. "Do you look so bad?" Dad brushed it off, as usual. "It's all right, daughter," he said, but Nancy sensed something was wrong with him. He complained too often of nausea, headaches, and weakness. "Daddy, please see a doctor, I beg you. You need to get yourself examined. After all, you know that illness is better prevented than cured." Dad sighed. "I guess you're right, Nancy. I'll think about it." But he never did. He continued to work nonstop, taking no time for his health. Nancy graduated from the university with honors and began working as a journalist for the local newspaper. She wrote articles about culture, fashion, and city life. Nancy liked her work, which made her feel free and independent. But she did not forget about her father. One day she received a call from her stepmother. After a pause, Natalie informed her that her father had died. Nancy was shocked. She couldn't believe it, because she had always naively believed that her father would live for a long time. For the first few minutes, she couldn't say anything but cried. She cried not only for her father, but also for herself, because she couldn't be by his side during the last days of his life. Nancy couldn't even find the strength to leave the apartment. She did nothing but lie in bed and cry. It seemed to her that her whole life had fallen apart. That same day, Sidney came to visit her. "Nancy, I really feel for you," he said. "I can't believe your father is gone." She only nodded. Sidney sat down next to her on the bed and put his hand on Nancy's shoulder. "You know, I always thought your daddy was a very smart and strong man." "Yeah, you're right," Nancy whispered. "He was wonderful. I realize this is very hard for you right now, but please don't despair. You have to move on with your life." Nancy didn't answer anything, just stared at the floor. Sidney continued, "I know you don't want anything right now. But please don't shut yourself off. I'm always here for you. You can ask me for anything." "Thank you, Sidney," he said. "But I don't know what's next." "You can do anything. I believe in you." It had cost her a great deal of effort to begin making funeral arrangements for her father. Sidney had been by her side the whole time. Even at the cemetery, they stood with each other by the casket. As Nancy watched her father's face, it seemed to her that he was only asleep and would soon wake up. But of course he wasn't. The memorial luncheon was held in a home-like atmosphere. Nancy sat at the table surrounded by relatives. She was having a hard time. She couldn't eat anything, didn't want to talk. Natalie sat across from her with a haughty expression. Her eyes were filled with the thought of her late husband's inheritance. But Natalie did not know the most important thing, that her husband owned not only a network of garment factories, but also real estate in other countries, as well as a foreign bank account with $1 million. Most importantly, George had left the entire inheritance to his daughter. Nancy said with a sarcastic note in her voice, "Stepmother, you need to eat. You're so thin." "I can't," the woman replied. "No appetite." Natalie grinned, thinking about how she could get to the notary's office as soon as possible and get everything settled. How disappointed she was when the notary informed her that everything had gone to Nancy. Meanwhile, after the funeral, Sidney led the girl to her room and himself stayed in the living room looking through the newspapers. He soon noticed an article that a prominent businessman was missing in town. It indicated that the businessman was a cousin of George Williamson, and his disappearance could be connected with unknown criminals. At that moment, Sidney thought anxiously of Nancy. He could not leave her alone in such a situation. "Nancy, I've been thinking it would be good if you came to my place. You need some quiet time right now," Sydney said. She declined, replying that she would stay at her place. "I understand," Sydney agreed. "But at the same time, I'm very afraid to leave you alone. I'll get someone to watch you." Nancy sighed and said she needed to deal with her father's death. Sydney left the room and called her stepmother, Natalie. "I think it would be best if Nancy came with me," he said. "I don't care," she replied in a cold tone. "She's a grown girl. Let her decide where she wants to go." Sydney sensed that Natalie was trying to avoid responsibility again, realizing that there was no deal to be made with her. He decided that he would look after Nancy on his own. Sydney spent the night in the living room while the girl slept in her room. In the morning, he decided to talk to her again. "Nancy," he said, "I really want to help you. Well, tell me, what can I do for you?" Nancy looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "I don't know. I just need time," she replied. Sydney put his arm around her and said, "I'll be around for as long as you need me." "Thank you. I know you want to help," Nancy replied. Sydney smiled. Then 2 days later, Nancy received an email from an anonymous person. It said her father was in danger and could have been killed much sooner. The letter also stated the time and place of the meeting: the city cemetery, alley number 7, burial 148. Reviewing the letter over and over, Nancy couldn't believe what she read. Could it really be true? When Sydney saw her sitting at the table with the letter in her hands, he immediately asked what had happened. She silently showed him the letter. Sydney read it and turned pale. "Nancy, I don't think you should go in there. It could be a trap. Maybe you'd better call the police," he said. But Nancy only shook her head. In the back of her mind, she had decided at once that she could manage on her own. Sydney begged her to refuse, but she was firm in her decision. "Nancy, I'm very afraid for you," Sydney said. "I don't want anything to happen to you," Sydney said. "I know, Sydney. But I have to do it anyway. I'm a journalist, after all." "Or have you forgotten?" Nancy replied. Sydney shook his head, still not believing that she would actually go to the cemetery alone. All day long, time dragged slowly. Finally, by the appointed time, Nancy approached the cemetery. Finding the right spot, she looked around: no one. She breathed a sigh of relief. Nancy stood alone for a few minutes, thinking about something of her own. Suddenly, in the twilight, 2 tall men with masks on their faces came out of the grave. Their voices sounded cold and lifeless, like those of indifferent mannequins. "Well, hello," Nancy said, one of them in a foreign accent. "We've been expecting you." She flinched, for she couldn't understand who they were or what they wanted from her. "Who are you?" she asked with alarm in her voice. "We want to talk to you," the other man replied. "There are some questions." Nancy stepped back. She felt trapped. "Stay back. I'll get help," she exclaimed. The strangers grinned and took a few steps toward her. She backed away, knowing full well that she couldn't escape them. "Please don't worry," one of them said. "We just want to talk." In their eyes, she saw not kindness, but malice and cruelty. And she realized with horror that they weren't going to talk to her at all. At the same instant, the men simultaneously grabbed her arms. Nancy cried out in pain and tried to break free, but they held her very tightly. She tried to resist, but the forces were unequal. The strangers threw her to the ground. Nancy closed her eyes in pain. "Calm down," one of them said. "No, and the first is not the last." They opened her mouth and poured some kind of liquid into it. Nancy felt a burning sensation in her throat, tried to protest, but couldn't say anything. The liquid quickly burned her throat, seeping into her bloodstream. At the same moment, Nancy lost consciousness, and a couple of strangers wrapped her body in a blanket and carried her to a car standing 100 meters away. It was only now, lying on the hard bed, that Nancy realized what a foolish thing she had done when she had come alone to the cemetery and become a victim. She awoke to someone gently stroking her arm. She opened her eyes and saw Mark Stevenson's wrinkled face. "Wake up," the old man whispered with a kind smile as he looked at her. "The sun is up, time for breakfast." Nancy tried to rise, but felt a sharp pain in her head. "Oh, did I really sleep all day?" she asked, trying to remember what had happened the night before. Overslept. Here's some hot tea for you. Take some bread and eat. I've boiled some oatmeal porridge here," the old man said. "Thank you," Nancy whispered, accepting the cup. She was already determined to get out of this dark and damp-smelling hovel. But when she saw the bread and honey that looked so appetizing, she decided to wait until her grandfather calmed down a bit. "Why don't you tell me about yourself?" Mark Stevenson said with a smile as he looked at her. "Who are you, and what brought you to the dump?" Nancy wondered, not knowing how to explain that she had come to the cemetery to meet strangers, but those strangers had tricked her and drugged her with something. Still, after a little hesitation, she told all she remembered of the night, lying on the hard bed. "Well, that's good," said Mark Stevenson, looking at her with interest. "It happens that people get into bad stories and then find themselves in a difficult position. But there's no need to despair. Nancy, you and I are sure to find a way out of this." Mark Stevenson stood up and, machine correcting the cap on his head, said, "Let's go to the police. You need to report it. They'll help." "What am I? A former pilot, now a tramp?" Without waiting for an answer, the owner left the shack, leaving Nancy alone with her thoughts. She squirmed involuntarily, feeling the warmth of the cup and a certain nervousness at the realization that she would have to face the police. But on the other hand, there was no other choice. They walked along narrow, winding paths lined with garbage, constantly skirting the huge piles that seemed to take up half the village. Everything around them exuded a putrid odor. Nancy wanted to clench her nose, but she tried not to show her displeasure. They walked for about half an hour before they came to the outskirts of the dump, smoothly transitioning into the urban wasteland. "Here's the stop," Mark Stevenson pronounced tiredly, looking at the pavilion. "Let's wait, the buses run here." Nancy looked at the busy highway that ran past the junkyard. Cars were traveling at breakneck speed, leaving clouds of exhaust behind them. "Come on, Nancy. Let's go to the pavilion," Mark Stevenson said, nudging her lightly toward the bus stop. "There are benches there you can rest. Don't worry, I know the place. We'll take the bus to the center of town now, and everything's close by there." Nancy nodded. She was glad her grandfather was with her. He was reassuring, hopeful. Soon the bus pulled up and they stepped inside. Nancy quickly took the window seat, and Mark Stevenson went to pay the fare with change. Her mood improved noticeably. She finally felt like Nancy Carson again, a rich heiress who worked as a journalist and lived as an ordinary girl. The bus started, and Nancy watched the houses go by through the window. The landfill, with its garbage, rats, the smell of rot, and endless mountains of trash, was behind her. Everything was different in the city. The buildings were clean, the air much fresher. It seemed even the people were kinder. Nancy was overwhelmed with a strange mixture of relief and joy. After all, it wasn't every day that events like being kidnapped and left in a landfill happened. The sun was shining, and the rays caressed her cheeks like a mother's loving hands. She smiled at the sun, and to herself too. After all, life went on, which meant everything would be okay. "Here we are," Mark Stevenson said, bringing her out of her musings. A minute later, they got off the bus and headed toward the police building. "Don't worry," Nancy, her grandfather, reassured her. "It'll be okay. They'll help." Inside the station, she was greeted by a young policeman with a friendly smile and a penetrating gaze. "You must be Anastasia Carson." "That's a familiar face. Just saw it in the orientation," he asked, extending his hand. "Where's your fiancé, Sydney, waiting for you already? He's got everyone on edge. A scandalous fellow, I'll tell you that." Nancy was taken aback. And then her boyfriend came out in person. "Sydney," she whispered, not believing her eyes. Sydney put his arms around her and pulled her close. "I've been here for the last hour," he said. "Reported you missing. Officially, it was supposed to be a 3-day wait, but I insisted. Anyway, hot on the trail, they figured out who sent you the letter in the mail and who kidnapped you from the cemetery, and tried to eliminate you by leaving you at the dump." "And who is that?" asked the question that had plagued her all along. "Your stepmother's cousins Herman and Albert," Sydney answered. "Natalie didn't want you to inherit. Called them from abroad. She thought it would be easier to get rid of you than to try to divide the estate through the courts." I still don't understand, Nancy whispered. How could she do that to me? Long envious of you and your life, Sydney said. Wanted all the power and assets centered in her hands. Nancy was silent, gazing into his face. She couldn't believe her stepmother was capable of such meanness. And how did you know all this? Nancy asked. I know a little man who works for the police. He listened to me, and together we gathered information about your disappearance. What about Natalie's brothers? They're already being interviewed. They'll be put in the detention center soon. Then the investigation, then the trial. I still can't believe it. There's too much evil and deception. Sydney hugged her. It's going to be okay. You're free. I'm with you. Nancy clung to him, feeling warm and protected. She also realized that Sydney was her only real family. I'm so glad you found me, she whispered. At that moment, a woman in a black dress was led into the police station. Her face was pale and her eyes were red from crying. Nancy, whispered the stepmother, walking up to her and squeezing her in her arms. Forgive me, Nancy, I didn't mean to see you. It was all Herman and Albert. They made me do it. I didn't know it would turn out this way. They just promised to scare me a little. But Nancy didn't believe a word of it, especially after the investigation had revealed that it had been her stepmother, who had added a drug to the late George Williamson's food, an overdose of which could cause cardiac arrest. Nancy looked at her with emptiness in her eyes. Natalie, who for so long had pretended to be caring, loving, who pretended to care about Nancy's well-being, actually wanted her dead. And all these years her stepmother had hidden her greed, her perfidy under a mask of virtue. As if reading her thoughts, Sydney pressed her hand against his. You don't have to believe her, he said firmly. All the evidence has been gathered. Her lies won't help. He understood her and pulled her close to him. Sydney, Nancy whispered as Sydney held her hand and led her toward the exit. You don't know how grateful I am. You saved me. Come on, he smiled. You know I'm always ready to help. I know, Nancy said, tears welling up in her eyes. And I love you for it. I love you too, Sydney replied, taking her hand gently. The sun was already at its zenith, painting the rooftops and sky in bright colors. When the young people left the police building, Nancy continued, Sydney, you are the only one I want by my side, and I want you to be my wife. He pulled a velvet box from his pocket, opened it carefully. Inside glittered a modest ring with a stone. Will you marry me? She answered him with a tender kiss, silently saying yes. They decided to have the wedding on a motorboat. It had been Nancy's dream. She had always wanted a romantic wedding on the water, under the stars, surrounded by beautiful lights. Sydney did everything he could to make her dream come true. He booked a magnificent motor ship decorated with white roses and garlands of white lights, ordered the best orchestra in town that played magical jazz-style tunes, and hired the best photographer to capture every happy moment of the event. Nancy was the most beautiful bride. She wore a new white dress in the Greek style, a wide skirt and deep cleavage, which favorably emphasized her figure. Around her neck she wore a pearl necklace that was impossible to take one's eyes off of. When Nancy went on deck and saw Sydney standing on the bridge waiting for her, Anne could not hold back tears of happiness. Their wedding was simply magical. Friends and relatives shouted, "Hallelujah," then they danced and sang together under the stars. Sydney and Nancy twirled in a slow dance, clinging to each other and feeling the love. Among the guests, of course, was Mark Stevenson, dressed in the uniform of a retired pilot, shouting with everyone bitter the former tramp couldn't stop crying, thanking fate for bringing him together with such good people. The first months after the celebration passed in a romantic atmosphere of happiness and joy. Sydney and Nancy lived together in a house by the river. Their bedroom windows overlooked the water, and in the morning they woke each other up with the sounds of the waves and birdsong. Sydney loved to cook breakfast for Nancy, making her delicious fresh fruit salad and strong coffee. And Nancy often sat on the balcony admiring the sunrise and wrote her articles. And in the evenings they would walk along the beach, holding hands, talking about all sorts of little things. Breathing in the fresh air, soaked with the scents of the river and greenery, Sydney smiled and, looking at Nancy, felt himself the happiest man in the world. And they both felt that their lives were just beginning. At the funeral, the husband couldn't hammer a nail, and as soon as the wife was lowered into the grave, the mistress whispered about the inheritance. The burial did not start with leaden gloom from the very morning. A fine rain drizzled continuously, as if nature itself was mourning her along with the few mourners who had come to the funeral. Dylan shifted nervously from foot to foot as he stood by the fresh graves. In his hands, he could hardly hold a heavy hammer and several nails, which he was going to hammer personally into the lid of his late wife's coffin. "Dylan, come to the grave," came the harsh voice of Priscilla, his mother. "My shoes are wet, and I'm wet myself. I don't want to catch a cold." Tricia, a spectacular brunette with bright red lips, stood a little farther away, wrapped in a light shawl. Her expression remained impenetrable. Little did they know that Tricia had been in an affair with Dylan for a little less than a year. "Mom, please don't rush me. It's a funeral after all," Dylan mumbled, trying desperately to get his trembling fingers on the nail head. "Exactly," Priscilla poked. "It's a lot of trouble with these funerals. It's a good thing you organized it quickly. Connections solve everything, as they say. And that Dr. Ethan was experimenting, and now he's under investigation. And his son could end up in an orphanage." Dylan remained silent, trying to hammer a nail in. The damp earth seemed to want to pull him into its cold embrace, along with the coffin. The rain was slowly turning the cemetery into a kind of damp and dreary realm. But no matter how many times he tried to hammer in a nail, it was all in vain. Either the wood was too hard, or Dylan's skills were at a child's level. "Dylan, maybe we shouldn't do this. The workers can do it themselves. They don't eat their bread for nothing," Priscilla reminded herself again. But her son only gripped the handle of the hammer tighter, like an experienced craftsman. "You see, my dear," continued the mother, watching his clumsy attempts. "I always told you that Chloe was no match for you, no match at all. That's all I've ever told you." Mom, Dylan shouted irritably and threw the hammer into the dirt. "Let's talk about something else, okay?" "Well, what else is there to talk about?" "I told you at the wedding, remember, that it was a mistake. You wanted a wife who was good looking, so you wouldn't be ashamed to show people. Tricia, for instance." Priscilla wouldn't stop. Tricia, who had remained silent until then, coughed slightly, drawing attention to herself. "Priscilla, really, you shouldn't," she whispered, fixing a strand of perfectly styled hair. "Let's do this some other time, okay? This isn't the time for this kind of talk." "Why wouldn't it be?" Priscilla frowned. "Chloe is already on the other side of the world, and you're so young and handsome. Dylan, don't be a fool, don't miss your happiness." He looked at his mother expressively, making it clear that it was definitely not worth developing this topic now. All right, I'll be quiet." Priscilla raised her hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Just make sure you nail it down tight, or she might decide to come back." Dylan gritted his teeth and hit the nail hard, but it bounced off the coffin lid with a nasty sound, like a spring, and fell into the dirt in front of the two gravediggers, who waited patiently for the command to begin the burial. "No, I can't," he whispered, stepping back. "Let's get out of here." Tricia, without a word, took him under her arm, Priscilla joining in. It didn't take much persuasion, and soon the three of them were heading for the cemetery exit, leaving the two gravediggers to do their usual business. Dylan took the lead rather quickly, leaving the women behind. "You know," Priscilla, Tricia whispered as they walked a few steps away from the grave. "She made a will before she died. I'm her personal hairdresser, her beauty master. But she had no beauty in her life." Priscilla, who had been vigorously making her way through the cemetery mud, stopped abruptly and stared suspiciously at her son's companion. "A will?" she asked, squinting her eyes. "And what is in it? Did she give all her rags to her girlfriends, down to the last trinket?" "Priscilla Adams has not rags, but a fortune. A horse farm. Can you believe it? She bought it just before she died, took all her money out of circulation and invested the last of it." Tricia jabbed dismissively, adjusting her expensive leather purse on her shoulder. "Arabian horses." Priscilla Adams choked with surprise. "What kind of, God forbid, elite horses?" Tricia said meaningfully, enjoying the effect her words had. "English thoroughbreds. Chloe, as it turned out, was well versed in this. Priscilla Adams, not believing her ears, sank down on the nearest bench. The rain continued, but she seemed not to notice neither the penetrating dampness nor the drops running down her face. Farms. Horses. She muttered to herself. And who was going to get all this good stuff now? Dylan. Who else? Tricia shrugged. He's the sole heir now. Priscilla Adams straightened sharply. A wicked light flickered in her eyes. Thank you, my daughter, for enlightening me. I didn't even know about it. I didn't really care for him. She said that, and Tricia, smiling to herself, continued her thought. Exactly, Priscilla Adams. Dylan is a city boy. He's a newcomer to the farm, no clue. Imagine what will happen if he, therefore, inherits the rights of inheritance, and what to do next does not understand. Oh, come on. This farm won't last long with an owner like that. He'll squander it all in no time, son. You'll see. I know him well. Priscilla Adams shook her head meaningfully. But if he had a woman with him who was smart, and knew her way around a horse, Tricia said, and gave Priscilla Adams a meaningful glance. Well, that's a different matter. Her mother instantly picked up on the theme. Then, my dear, you need to keep an eye and an eye to organize everything properly, and not to give a hand to anyone, and to keep Dylan safe from all the easy money hunters, Tricia added. Sure, she said, taking Priscilla Adams under her arm. Is that right? Oh, right? Priscilla Adams let herself be led toward the cemetery exit. We'll get through this, Tricia. We'll keep Dylan safe. The rain cried tears of sorrow and persisted, turning the clay soil of the cemetery into a shaky mess. One of the gravediggers, Ethan, adjusted a heavy burden on his shoulder and nodded to his partner. Well, Ben, take the coffin. Let's go slowly, carefully, so as not to inadvertently. He didn't finish. They were afraid even to say aloud what their superstitious consciousness told them. Ben, a tall, thin, victim-like man of indeterminate age, nodded silently, accepting his end of the coffin. Soon they lowered it onto the special stands prepared for the final journey. At that moment, some quiet, barely audible sound was heard from the depths of the wooden box. Ethan, thinking that it was the wind playing with the dilapidated blanket, did not pay any attention to it. The kingdom of heaven to the servant of God, he muttered, crossing himself. She was young, barely breathing. She had gone so early. They say it was a tumor, Ben said quietly, adjusting the rope. How do you know? Ethan grinned. From his hands. Dylan Thomas Eggle has already been to the netherworlds. Wow, what a beauty. I went to the modeling club with this widower when I was a kid. And Ethan, not sharing the talkativeness of his partner, suddenly froze. The strange sound from the coffin was repeated, this time more clearly. It was echoed by a muffled thud. Ben, did you hear that? He whispered, grabbing his partner's sleeve. It's, Ben started to say. But a distinctive groan came from the coffin. Ethan froze. The blood rushed from his face. Ben jumped back as if scalded. Ugh, he whispered. The cross is not good, nothing good. The groan was repeated, longer this time, full of longing and fear. What on earth is that? Ethan couldn't stand it and cautiously, step by step, approached the coffin. Ethan, don't do it, Ben exclaimed pleadingly. Ethan. He hesitated for a moment, and then abruptly threw back the lid, which Dylan had never been able to penetrate. What he saw made him stagger backward. The fan's eyes were wide open and staring straight at him. Jesus, he whispered, grabbing end. Chloe's alive. Ben, who had been standing off to the side until then, stepped closer and peered into the coffin, as if to confirm Ethan's words. Chloe blinked slowly, her lips pursed. Water, she whispered. Ethan rushed to the pot of water they always took with them just in case. Ben, meanwhile, helped Chloe sit up. She was pale as chalk. Her hands were shaking, but there was a spark of insight in her eyes. What's wrong? Ben asked, handing her a cup of water. How did you end up here? Chloe drank greedily, without tearing up. When the cup was empty, She took a deep breath and began to tell some incredible story about how a medical error almost caused her death, about how she woke up in a coffin and realized that she was going to be buried alive. Ethan and Ben listened to her story with their mouths open, unable to utter a word. They were simple people, used to dealing with the dead, not the resurrected. "What do we do now?" Ethan finally asked. When Chloe finished her story, the question was addressed more to herself than to the woman. Ben scratched the back of his head, looking into Chloe's face. "I don't know," he muttered. "I've never seen such a thing in my life." Ethan, unlike his partner, pulled himself together quickly enough. "So first of all, we have to get out of here," he said resolutely. "Or relatives will come back and see you in good health and will be scared." Chloe, rising from the coffin, nodded in agreement. She still felt weak, but was grateful to fate for the second chance. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Ethan and Ben. "If it weren't for you." "Oh, come on." Ethan waved his hand. "You're welcome." Ben helped Chloe out of the grave. The rain, as if by order, stopped, causing the gravediggers the feeling that nature itself rejoiced at her miraculous rescue. "Shall we go, old lady?" Ethan asked, looking at the woman. Chloe sighed sadly and gently took him under her arm. At the same time, Dylan and his companions hurried to solve the issue with the inheritance. The notary office was located in the very center of the city. Dylan with difficulty found a place for a car in the cramped parking lot and helped the women to get out. "Well, son, are you ready to become an heir to $1 million fortune?" Priscilla Adams asked with a smile as they walked up the wide staircase. "We're not exaggerating," Dylan murmured. But in his heart he was flattered by the new word millionaire. The office was waiting for them. A young secretary led them into a spacious office, where a man in a strict suit sat behind a massive desk. Come in," the notary pointed to the chairs. "I understand that you are about the inheritance of Chloe Degtyaryeva?" "That's right," Priscilla Adams replied, settling down in the chair. "This is my son Dylan Palit Degtyarov, and the only heir." "It's a pleasure," the notary nodded. "As far as I know, Chloe Dmitrievna left a will. Slowly, grandson." He opened the folder and began to list. So according to the documents, Chloe Dmitrievna owned a 30-head stable, a land plot of 10 hectares, residential houses and outbuildings. Dylan listened to him in the semi-darkness. Figures and legal terms merged in his head into a colorless hum. He was already drawing pictures of a new life, a luxurious mansion instead of a cramped apartment, an expensive car, traveling. However, the notary's voice sounded strange. "I must warn you that the property of Chloe Dmitrievna is under arrest." "What?" Dylan jumped out of his chair. "What arrest? What are you talking about?" "Calm down, son," Priscilla Adams put her hand on his shoulder. "Let's just get this over with." "What's that supposed to mean?" Dylan asked the notary. He sighed and fixed his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "It's very simple. As I understand, shortly before her death, Chloe Dmitrievna took a loan on the security of her property. The amount of the loan is impressive, and alas, she did not have time to repay it." "A loan?" Dylan looked at the notary confusedly. "But why did she need a loan?" "Exactly why?" Priscilla Adams squinted. "Chloe, as far as I can remember, has never taken out a loan." "Well, we'll find out," Dylan whispered, clenching his fists. "I knew she was up to something." "Please, let's not have any of this theatrics," the notary frowned. "It's all legal. I have the loan documents with that." He pulled papers out of a folder and held them out to Dylan. He took the papers with trembling hands and began to read. Figures danced in front of his eyes, letters popped up, his head was spinning. "Well, what's to be done? How can we do this?" "There aren't many options," the notary answered. "Either pay off the loan in full, and then the inheritance passes to you, or..." Priscilla Adams leaned forward. "Or the bank seizes the property for debt," the notary finished. There was dead silence in the office. "So we get nothing?" Dylan asked hoarsely. "We're getting it, son. We're getting it big time." Priscilla Adams stood up. "We're going to fight. This firm belongs to you by right, and we'll find a way to prove that Chloe took this loan illegally." Saying this, she proudly walked out of the office, dragging her stunned son and Tricia behind her. The rain outside the window played out with renewed vigor, drumming on the windows and seeming to laugh at their misfortune. "Hang in there," Ethan said, and tightly gripping Chloe's elbow, helped her over the crooked fence of the cemetery. "Now we'll warm up in the warmth, we'll drink hot tea with raspberry jam, and everything will seem like a terrible dream. Ain't that right, Ben?" Ben, who was walking a little behind, nodded silently. He hadn't said a word since Chloe had come out of the grave, and he kept looking at her warily, as if he expected her to melt into the air like a ghost. The light in the old woman's window was quite close. Chloe, driven by cold curiosity, quickened her step. Petrovich, as far as she understood from Ethan's stories, was an iconic figure in the cemetery. A former gamekeeper who had served time for self-defense, he was known as a stern and taciturn man. But at the same time, as Ethan claimed, he had a golden soul. The hut of the old woman Stepan Petrovich was a small wooden hut, nestled at the very edge of the cemetery. Coming closer, Chloe heard the muffled barking of a dog coming from inside. "Don't be frightened, it's Zhuchka, a kind soul. Except that she doesn't like strangers. Petrovich picked her up as a puppy. Since then they have been inseparable," Ethan explained. Noticing how Chloe tensed, he knocked on the door. The barking increased, joined by a hoarse male voice. Finally, the door opened, and Petrovich appeared on the threshold. He was a sturdy grandfather with graying hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through the man. He was wearing an old cotton jacket and rubber overshoes on his feet. "To what do I owe the honor?" he asked hoarsely, eyeing the guests suspiciously. "Petrovich, I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour," Ethan began, trying to speak as conciliatory as possible. "But here's the situation. It's urgent. It's necessary to decide." Without saying a word, the host stepped back, letting the guests inside. Chloe carefully stepped over the threshold and found herself in a small but cozy room. In the corner stood an iron bed, covered with a patchwork quilt. Opposite was a massive wooden table. On the wall hung a photograph of a woman in a scarf, and next to it an old clock. The bug, having made sure that the guests were allowed to enter, calmed down and now looked at the guests with curiosity, wagging its tail. "Come in, don't be afraid," Ethan smiled, noticing Chloe's hesitation. "The bug has already sniffed you. Decided you weren't dangerous." Chloe smiled shyly back and sat down on the edge of the creaky table. "You need to change into something dry for starters," Petrovich muttered, turning to the guests. "My wife has left her change of clothes just in case. Of course it's far from your size, but it'll do for the first time." He went off into the next room and returned with an armful of clothes. "Here you are," he handed Chloe a sweater and a long skirt. "And I'll put the tea on in the meantime." Chloe gratefully took the clothes and went to change behind the screen. Ben and Ethan tactfully went outside, luring the restless dog behind them. In the depth of her soul, Chloe was touched by the care of those people, recently completely unknown to her. Fate gave her a second chance, and she was determined not to miss it. Chloe came out from behind the screen, feeling a little awkward in a spacious skirt and a knitted sweater, smelling of lavender and something subtly homely. She sat down in the chair again, trying not to look at Ethan, who had returned to the house and was watching her closely. The hot tea and jam warmed her throat pleasantly, helping her relax. Where to start? Chloe muttered, looking at the carved patterns on the tabletop. My whole life turned upside down a couple months ago. Well, Preston squinted and leaned back in his chair. Take your time, start from the beginning. And Chloe began her story about how she lived with her parents in a small town when she was a child, how her father worked as an engineer at a factory, and her mother taught music at school, about how unexpectedly for everyone Dad decided to go into business and left the usual, so familiar business. Then they moved to the capital, where they bought a luxury apartment in the center and an expensive car. My father always dreamed of having his own business, Chloe continued, noticing the flicker of interest in Ethan's eyes. He opened a chain of small bakeries, and Mom devoted herself to helping Dad. You had golden parents, Preston said quietly, pouring the rest of the flavored drink into cups. They were the best. Chloe's voice trembled. She turned away to the window to hide her tears. Unfortunately, their happiness didn't last long. 5 years ago, they died in a car accident. Chloe was silent, unable to speak anymore. Preston nodded sympathetically. The silence was broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace. It seemed to me then that the ground was falling away from under my feet. Chloe continued, having collected her thoughts. I was all alone. But I had to move on. I had to do things, to solve issues with the inheritance. It was a heavy burden, Ethan said, for the first time raising his voice. Apparently, Ben didn't want to go into the story and went about his business. Yes, it wasn't easy, sighed Chloe. But I got through it. Lawyers helped to sort out all the formalities. Now I have my own business money, but it does not bring joy. I accept, nodded Preston. Money is not everything in life. What about the doctors and the clinic? You mentioned some kind of disease? Chloe took a sip of tea, gathered her courage. A few weeks ago, I began to feel bad dizziness, weakness. At first, I didn't pay attention. I thought I was just tired. Then I started having memory lapses. I was frightened, turned to the best specialists, lay on the examination in an expensive private clinic. And what did these doctors say? Preston asked. They said a tumor with difficulty pronounced these words, Chloe, not operable. They gave me no more than 6 months. Jesus, whispered Emily, pale. I could not believe my ears. My whole life flashed before my eyes because I had no time to do anything. My family, my kids, it was gone, and all I had left was money. What do I need it for now? Well, one doctor, Dixon, tried to help, but it didn't work. Apparently it was a medical error, and they thought I was dead. She was silent, trying to deal with a wave of despair. Don't despair too soon, Preston said, smiling affectionately. I don't know what those townspeople have told you. I know how they like to get money out of rich people. But we have a doctor from God in our neighborhood. If you want, I can introduce with gratitude. Chloe looked at the old man. In his words sounded such confidence and strength that she involuntarily infected with his optimism. Thank you, she whispered. At that moment, Chloe's eyes clouded, especially after she remembered her husband and her acquaintance with him. She leaned back in her chair, and pictures of the past flashed before her eyes like a movie. A young, then still budding businesswoman. She was hurrying along the platform, desperately trying not to miss the train. She was clutching her ticket in one hand and dragging a heavy suitcase in the other, stumbling at every step. As always, Chloe grumbled to herself under her nose, I'm always late. Suddenly the suitcase caught on something and she, not keeping her balance, flew forward. Chloe had already prepared for a painful fall, but suddenly someone's strong hands picked her up, not letting her fall. Chloe raised her head and saw a clown in front of her, literally and figuratively. Bright, screaming yellow overalls, ridiculous red boatie, huge shoes, and a funny red wig with strands sticking out in different directions. He had funny makeup on his face, a white potato nose, and a painted-on grin up to his ears. He looked at her with a slight smile, and there were cheerful sparks dancing in the corners of his eyes. We're with you. It's all right. Mademoiselle, the stranger's voice was as unusual as his appearance. Yes, thank you, Chloe blushed embarrassedly, fighting the urge to hide behind her own suitcase. I'm just in a bit of a hurry. Let me help you. The stranger picked up the suitcase as if it weighed nothing. Where are you headed? To the sea, Chloe replied, still feeling awkward. Oh, what a coincidence, the man smiled radiantly. I'm going to the sea, too. Chloe couldn't hold back a chuckle. I'm sorry, she muttered. Just so unexpectedly handsome, the clown winked at her. I've had success with the ladies, you know. I don't doubt it, Chloe smiled. But you're not going to ride the train looking like that, are you? Why not? He adjusted his boatie with comical importance. I'm an entertainer. Dylan the clown. I beg your pardon, who Chloe introduced herself. It's a pleasure, Chloe. Dylan. Well, I suggest we pass the time together, and he gallantly offered his hand, not letting her bulky suitcases out of the other. To Chloe's relief and the surprise of the other passengers, when the train moved, Dylan went to the restroom, from where he came back in ordinary clothes, without makeup and clown costume. He seemed even more attractive, tall, with a strong-willed chin and kind eyes. Now that's different, Chloe smiled. When Dylan came back, I was beginning to think I was going to have to drive all the way to the sea in the company of a clown. Don't be afraid, I don't bite, Dylan grinned. Have a seat across from me. It's just my job. He told Chloe that he was going on tour as part of a circus troupe. It turned out that Dylan wasn't just a clown, but a hopeful artist, acrobat, and juggler all in one. Chloe listened with bated breath. She had never met such people, open, kind, cheerful. And where will you be from? Dylan asked. Chloe told about herself, her work as an accountant, modest life in a small town, and her dream to see the sea. They talked the whole evening, and when it was time for bed, Chloe caught herself thinking that she didn't want the day to end. I tell you what, Dylan, she said, as they were already lying on their shelves. I've never met a girl like you. You're so real. Really, she marveled. Yes, Dylan nodded. You don't have an ounce of falseness. You say what you think and do what you think is right. That's rare these days. She remained silent, but her heart beat joyfully in her chest. Chloe herself did not notice how much she had become attached to this unusual travel companion in just one day. The next day they drove to the sea. Dylan had to go to the hotel, and Chloe went to look for her aunt, whom she came to visit. Chloe, wait, Dylan caught up with her on the platform. I don't know if I'll see you again, but I'd like to, he faltered, then pulled a small red clown nose out of his pocket and held it out to Chloe. It's a keepsake for you, he muttered embarrassedly. So you don't forget Dylan the clown. Thank you, Chloe took the gift, feeling everything inside clench with sadness. I won't forget you either. They said goodbye and she walked away, clutching the clown's nose in her hand. It seemed to her that this was just a summer adventure that would never be repeated. But fate had decreed otherwise. My God, was it really us so happy, so carefree, Chloe thought, willy-nilly remembering the day of her wedding. Dylan in a strict black suit, with excitement, fire in his eyes, and she, radiant, in a luxurious white dress, with a bouquet of delicate lilies in her hands, and next to them stood the guests, joyful and excited. All except one woman, whose face in Chloe's memory remained cold and unapproachable, as if carved from stone. It was Priscilla Adams, who had never accepted her daughter-in-law. Their acquaintance began with open dislike, which later turned into a real Cold War. Chloe, accustomed to be a support for all around, tried to establish relations with her mother-in-law, but all her attempts broke down against a wall of arrogance and rejection. Come on, Dylan tried to reassure her after the next scene. Chloe is a beautiful girl. She loves me, and that's enough. She loves you? Priscilla Adams mocked him. And she's just screwing with you. You're talented, handsome. You could have found a better match. Dylan's voice trembled. But stop, please. I love Chloe, and we're going to be together whether you want us to be or not. Priscilla Adams begrudgingly accepted her son's choice, but her relationship with her daughter-in-law remained strained. Chloe tried not to pay attention to the oblique glances and caustic remarks, but resentment had accumulated in her soul. She loved Dylan with all her heart, dreamed of a friendly family, but these dreams were shattered by the harsh reality. So, girl, when can we expect grandchildren? This question Priscilla Adams asked at every opportunity, caustically pressing her lips. Mom, we are not ready, tiredly answered for his wife Dylan, stroking her hand to smooth over the awkwardness. Not ready to prolong the birth. How long can we wait? Time is running out. Or are you, dear daughter-in-law, going to build your favorite career instead of thinking about your family? Chloe was silent, praying to God not to snap. With the money from the business of her late parents, she opened a large firm where everyone appreciated and respected her. But for her mother-in-law, it did not matter at all. In her eyes, Chloe remained only an upstart who dared to steal a precious son. Despite all the difficulties, Chloe and Dylan were happy, and their love, which was born in the very train that took them to the sea, grew stronger every year. You know, Ben, Dylan said, snuggling up to her after a hard day, I'm so happy I met you then. You are my talisman, my happiness, my everything. Chloe caressingly stroked his hair, inhaling such a native smell, and the world around ceased to exist. In these moments there was no grief, no problems. There were only two hearts in love, who found each other against all odds. However, fate, as if testing their relationship for strength, prepared them a new test. During a performance in the circus, performing a difficult trick, Dylan fell from a height. Severe spinal injuries, the doctor ruthlessly stated. It is necessary to operate urgently otherwise. He stopped, his eyes fixed on them. Or else what? Clinging to the last hope, asked Chloe. Otherwise he will remain an invalid for the rest of his life, the doctor finished quietly, averting his gaze. The operation required expensive, abroad, at the best specialists in musculoskeletal injuries. Priscilla Adams didn't have that kind of money, and she was in no hurry to help her daughter-in-law, with whom she had not found a common language. Nothing, do not worry, soothed her on the phone friend Maggie. We will help you, collect money, but we will not leave you in trouble. But Chloe planned to act on her own. She sold her apartment, her car, everything she owned. She even borrowed money from friends, co-workers. Chloe, don't. I don't want you to do this. I do not want you to sacrifice everything for me, begged her husband Ethan. Chloe affectionately stroked his cheek. How can I do otherwise? You are my whole life, my beloved husband. Yes, I would give everything to make you healthy. The operation was a success. Dylan was on the mend. He looked at her with endless gratitude and love. You saved my life, he whispered. I will be forever in your debt. After Dylan's discharge from the hospital, Priscilla Adams, to Chloe's surprise, did not even thank her, taking everything for granted. Despite the success of the operation with the circus, Dylan had to break up with it. It had been 8 months since the day Chloe had brought him back to life. 8 months filled with concern for her husband, worry for his health, and desperate attempts to regain the former ease in their relationship. But with each passing day, the wall of misunderstanding between them grew higher and the chasm of estrangement deeper. Dylan, once cheerful and carefree, turned into a withdrawn, irritable man. He sat for hours at the window, staring at one point. He answered Chloe's questions one syllable, or even did not speak at all. Dylan, what's going on with you? One day Chloe couldn't stand it, unable to bear the things of silence any longer. You stopped talking to me at all? I stopped smiling. He looked at her, as if not recognizing her. It's all right, he mumbled, turning away from the window. Leave me alone. Chloe's heart clenched with pain. Earlier he called her affectionate names, did not let her down from her loving eyes. Now, in his gaze read only indifference, if not contempt. She tried to regain his interest, to surround him with care and attention, as in the first days after the operation. Cooked his favorite dishes, bought tickets to the theater, invited friends. But it was all in vain. Dylan remained deaf and indifferent to her efforts. One evening, sorting out the papers on his desk, Chloe came across a bright red card in the shape of a heart. There was no signature or address on it, only a few lines scrawled in sprawling handwriting. I look forward to our meeting. Your bunny. Chloe felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. So that's what it is, he has another one. That thought made her feel as if she was burned with icy fire. She rushed to Dylan, who was smoking on the balcony. What is it? Chloe exclaimed in a broken voice, throwing the card at his feet. Who is this woman? The husband nonchalantly picked up the message, ran his eyes over the text and indifferently threw. I do not know what it's about. Probably someone mistook the address. Not me. Chloe's eyes flashed with anger. I see how you've changed. You don't love me anymore. Dylan looked at her silently, and in his eyes Chloe was horrified to see something she had never noticed before, a cold emptiness. Tell me, have you ever loved me at all? With difficulty Emily squeezed out, feeling the tears coming. Dylan didn't answer anything, just turned away, as if from an annoying fly. And at that moment Chloe realized her worst fears were confirmed. There was no room for her in his heart. The next days stretched like in a fog. She felt devastated, broken. She had lost everything: her beloved husband, the meaning of life, hope for the future. One morning when she woke up, she felt sick. Her head was spinning, her eyes were swimming, and her whole body felt so weak that she could hardly move. Chloe tried to call Dylan, but his voice sounded like a hoarse whisper. Gathering the rest of her strength, she reached for her cell phone and dialed the number of the ambulance. The hospital had found a tumor. Doctors talked about a complex operation, long rehabilitation, that the chances of a full recovery are small. But Chloe did not care much. She did not care whether she survived or not. Her husband, having learned about her illness, did not show a single drop of sympathy or concern, just dryly threw, "I hope it will not take long," and left, slamming the door. At this moment, Chloe realized that she had finally lost her husband. He became a stranger to her, like a distant star, on which she had once made her wish. And time in the hospital flowed like molasses. Days were replaced by nights, merging into a colorless succession of pain, weakness, and apathy. She had little hope of recovery. The doctors, as if conspiring, spoke of surgery with reluctance, as if delaying the inevitable. Who cares, Tricia thought. Dylan had betrayed her, trampled on her heart, leaving only a gaping void. One morning, an unfamiliar doctor entered the room tall, with a piercing gaze. Dixon radiated calmness and confidence. "My name is Dixon," he introduced himself. "I think I can help you." Emily raised an eyebrow incredulously. There was power in his voice, but the rumors about him were most contradictory. They said he used unconventional treatments that weren't recognized by official science. Help? Adam grinned bitterly. "You're too late, doctor. My disease is incurable." Dixon crouched on the edge of the bed, gazing intently into her eyes. "Well, it's not all that certain. I've reviewed your medical history, and I have my assumptions. But first I'll need your consent. Are you willing to take that risk?" Chloe hesitated. On the one hand, skepticism and disbelief, but on the other hand, a desperate hope simmered somewhere in the depths of her soul. But she whispered, "There's nothing to lose, it seems to me. Let's give it a try." Dixon's treatment proved to be a stern test. Andrew Evans, the clinic's chief physician, immediately absolved himself of all responsibility by making Dixon sign a document to that effect. Unusual treatments, infusion with bitter-tasting herbs, strict diet, all this exhausted Chloe even more. But she stubbornly followed the doctor's instructions. Sometimes in rare moments of enlightenment, it seemed to her that the condition seemed to improve. But then weakness overcame her again, erasing the fragile sprouts of hope. And Dylan never once visited his wife. He'd only called once, coldly inquiring about her condition. "So have the doctors given their prognosis yet?" Colorless voice asked the husband. "I don't know, Dylan, I don't know," Chloe replied tiredly. "I'm not asking anymore." I see he gritted through his teeth. "Listen, Chloe, I've been thinking. Anyway, so let's formalize the divorce. It'll be better for everyone." Chloe was silent, feeling her insides freezing. So everything was over definitively and irrevocably. "Can you hear me, Chloe?" "I can hear you," she replied quietly. "Do whatever you want. I don't care." Dylan did not call again. Chloe, having collected the rest of the funds and taking a large loan from the bank, bought a farm with elite horses which she had dreamed of for so many years. From a business point of view, the purchase was very well thought out. But she wanted so badly to please herself, even with the help of huge debts. It didn't matter. But how much of that life was left? And a few days later, Chloe felt quite bad. Her head was dizzy, colored circles swam before her eyes, and her heart clenched with pain, as if trying to break free. She tried to call for help, but her lips refused to move. Her eyelids felt leaden. The last thing that Chloe remembered was the worried face of the nurse, leaning over her, and Dixon's voice, giving orders when it began. For the first minute, she thought she was in hell. All around her there was pitch blackness. The air was heavy, and a stiffening pain emanated from her body. She tried to move, but realized she was enclosed in a tight space. Panic gripped her in an icy grip. Where was she? What was wrong with her? Suddenly, voices came to her hearing, which she later found out belonged to two young gravediggers. She was brought out of her state of sad reflection by the voice of Ethan, the caretaker, who became worried that her guest had become engrossed in herself. A new herbal tea was available on the table in front of her. Preston set a plate of hot potatoes and a piece of bread beside it. "Eat, daughter, eat. You need your strength," he grumbled, stroking his graying beard. "You've had enough fear, haven't you?" I could only nod. I couldn't say another word. My head was still clammy with the horror that made my blood run cold, and my memory was quick to recall every detail: the darkness, the smell of damp earth, and the voices. And then there was the creak of the shovel on the gravel and her own scream, full of terror and despair, which no one heard. "Thank you, Ethan," Chloe whispered, raising her eyes to him. "You saved my life, didn't you?" Ethan blushed and muttered that he didn't really need to thank her. He'd just done what anyone else would have done. "So what happens now?" Chloe asked after a brief silence. "After all, I've been presumed dead." Chloe realized that she had to tell the truth to the doctor. The doctor would be blamed for her death. At that moment, she immediately remembered Dixon, his tired voice, his insistence on treatment. He was the only one who believed that Chloe could get better. And now, because of this ridiculous incident, his career could be ruined. "I need to go into town right away," she said firmly. "I have to let everyone know the truth. It's already evening, and my car is acting up," Ethan said with his arms. "We'll drive it tomorrow morning. Don't worry." But she couldn't leave it for tomorrow. Every minute felt like her last. "Ethan, please," she begged. "Find a car, please. I'll pay for everything." Ethan hesitated for a while, but then sighed and, nodding, went out of the gatehouse. Chloe looked after him hopefully. Half an hour later, an old Jegulanok stopped at the gate of the cemetery. Ethan helped her to get into the cabin, and the car started. "I'm sorry to drag you into all this," she said, realizing the lengths Ethan had gone to for her. "It's nothing. Never mind," Ethan brushed it off. "You should have seen me when I pulled you out of the grave. That's where I was scared." Chloe smiled involuntarily. "Dixon was right," she said, looking thoughtfully out of the window. "He said there would be a second birth. And though there was still much about this second birth that was unclear and frightening, one thing she knew: she would fight for herself, for her life, and for the man who wasn't afraid to defy death for her." "Don't worry so much," Ethan said soothingly, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We'll figure it all out in a moment." She nervously tried to calm her shivers after the horror she'd experienced. The thought of going to the police made her unsure. "It's easy to say we'll figure it out," she muttered, looking out the window at the cars whizzing by. "The police wouldn't believe me. They'd say I was crazy. Who comes back from the dead to claim resurrection anyway?" "You're not crazy at all," Ethan said firmly, giving her a brief glance. "You were indeed mistreated, but we'll prove it. I mean, we have proof. After all, Ben did testify." "What if Andrew Evans, the head doctor, had it all figured out?" Chloe asked, feeling panic coming to her. Ethan braked sharply at the curb, causing Chloe to clutch the door in fright. "Chloe, listen to me, please," he said, turning to her. "I don't know what this Andrew Evans is up to, or whether anyone else is involved, but we must try, or all these scoundrels will go unpunished. You don't want that, do you?" Chloe shook her head negatively. "No, I don't. But I don't want to go to jail for slander either." "No one will put you in jail," Ethan said confidently. "You're the victim in this story. You just need to tell it like it really happened. And I'll be there for you." He smiled encouragingly, and Chloe felt the tension release a little. This gentleman with such warm eyes and calm voice gave her a strange feeling of security. "Okay," she nodded. "Let's give it a try." Ethan started the car again, and soon they pulled up in front of the police building. The office of the investigator on duty was small. Behind a desk piled with papers sat a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a surly expression. "Well, tell me," he said, casting a quick glance at them. "What's the incredible story?" Chloe gulped, feeling a lump coming up to her throat, and was ready to tell everything, when suddenly a panting policeman burst into the office. "Anise. It's about the gorilla," he said. And only then he noticed the investigator. "I'm sorry, Comrade Major, I didn't know you were busy. An hour." "Speak." The major waved his hand. "So what is it?" "Andrew Evans's lawyer is there," reported the policeman. He wants to see you about the statement of citizen Degtyaryeva. Degtyaryeva and Eva Dmitrievna, Chloe prompted. Yes, Degtyaryeva and Eva Dmitrievna, the policeman finished. She felt her hands go cold. Andrew Evans was already here. Did he know she was coming to the police? And had time to get a lawyer? Invite a lawyer, the major ordered. A few minutes later, a man in an expensive suit appeared in the office with a briefcase in his hands. Hello, he said, smiling a broad professional smile. Andrew Evans asked me to tell you that he sincerely regrets the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Chloe questioned, not believing her ears. You call it a misunderstanding? You almost buried me alive. I assure you, Chloe, there was an unfortunate mistake, said the lawyer, not even blushing. My client is deeply shocked by what happened. He has already dismissed the doctor, who was responsible for this tragic mistake, and is ready to pay you a generous compensation for moral damage. After these words, he took out a Scotch-wrapped cellophane bag from his briefcase and handed it to Chloe. Here is $5 million. I hope that this amount will be enough to forget about this unpleasant incident as a terrible dream. Chloe pushed the offering away with disgust. Do you think your money can compensate for what I've been through? Emily shrieked. I want Evans to answer for his crimes. He wanted to cover his tracks, so he refused to do an autopsy. And I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the first person to suffer at his hands. Chloe, calm down, the major said glumly. Do you have proof? Yes, I have proof, she said firmly, meeting her gaze with the frightened eyes of the lawyer. And I am prepared to provide it, but only in exchange for complete anonymity and protection. The lawyer nodded in agreement and walked out of the office with his lips pressed together. The next few days passed like in a fog. Chloe testified to the investigators, telling them everything she knew about Evans' machinations. And in fact, Dixon did everything right and was able to improve the patient's condition. But when there was a crisis, the head doctor realized that it was necessary to organize a funeral as soon as possible, so that the prosecutor's office did not get to the body and did not accuse him of everything that had happened. The next day, Chloe stood at the gate of the detention center, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her heart was beating in a frantic rhythm, anticipating the imminent meeting. The massive iron door creaked open, and Dixon, her physician, appeared on the threshold, an unwilling prisoner of this gloomy stronghold. His usually cheerful eyes were full of sadness, and his face was a mask of weariness. Seeing her with the bouquet, he could not restrain a warm smile. Chloe, are you alive? He whispered, not believing his eyes. Alive, Dixon. Emily replied with a smile, holding out the flowers. And it's all thanks to you. Apparently I was allergic to one of the drugs, which caused a state of coma, which the head doctor mistook for death. Dixon smiled and awkwardly accepted the bouquet, still unable to believe in the reality of what was happening. But how? He began. But she stopped him with a wave of her hand. All later, she said. The main thing now is that you are free. There's a car waiting for you. Indeed, there was a cab at the curb, its driver looking impatiently at his watch. Get in. Gently pushed Emily Dixon to the car. You need to rest. Come to your senses. And what about you? He asked anxiously. I'm fine now. Your treatment seems to have caused me remission, Chloe assured him. I need to see someone else. She waited until the cab was out of sight, and only then she went to her car. All the way to the house, she did not leave a strange feeling of desolation. So much energy had been devoted to fighting for justice, for Dixon's freedom, and for the truth to prevail. What now that the goal had been reached? Emily felt alone. I hope this passes, she tried to reassure herself as she turned down the familiar alley leading to the house. But as soon as she parked at the gate, her heart thudded with a bad feeling. Dylan's car was parked there. Chloe opened the gate, entered the yard, feeling the anxiety growing with every step. The door was ajar. Muffled voices came from inside. She quietly climbed the porch, peered into the living room. Her husband was sitting in an armchair with his leg over his leg. He was wearing the silk robe Chloe had given him for their wedding anniversary. Opposite, On the 60 coffee table was Tricia, her personal hairdresser, a young and spectacular brunette. "Dylan, are you sure this is the shade you want?" flirtatiously asked Tricia, showing him the palette with colors. "Yes, everything is so." Dylan lazily stretched out, sipping whiskey from a crystal glass with pleasure. Chloe froze in place, unable to utter a word. Her head was buzzing. Dark circles floated in front of her eyes. So he was cheating. All this time while Emily was fighting for her life. For justice, he was having fun with someone else. Tricia, noticing her reflection in the mirror, shrieked and dropped the palette, the paints, scattered across the floor like multicolored confetti. Chloe Preston. Voices rounded with horror. Dylan turned around and the glass slipped out of his hand, shattering into 1,000 shards. "Chloe, you're dead," he mumbled, stammering, pale as a sheet. "Yes, Dylan? It's me," Chloe said slowly, entering the room. "And you must have thought that I was already rotting in the grave." Dylan nervously twitched his apple of his eye. I can explain everything about this." Taking a step toward him, she backed away. "It's not necessary, Dylan. I can see everything perfectly well." Chloe looked around the living room. Broken glass, scattered paints, frightened face of Tricia, frozen window glass, everything spoke for itself. "Chloe Preston, I had nothing to do with it," he ventured. "What did you say?" she retorted. "I'm dead," Chloe finished coldly. "Yes, Tricia, have you heard about it? My lawyer has undoubtedly notified all concerned." Dylan raised his head. "What are you talking about?" Chloe grinned. "Don't pretend, Dylan. I know about your affairs. I know how you waited for my death to get the inheritance." "That's not true," Dylan exclaimed, blushing like a cancer. I loved you." "Do you love Tricia now?" Chloe asked, not taking her eyes off her husband. He turned pale, opened his mouth, but could not utter a word. "You see," sighed Chloe, "no more lies. I'm filing for divorce." "Divorce? But what about?" Dylan looked around helplessly, as if looking for support. "It's very simple." Chloe took out an envelope from her purse and threw it on the table. "Here are all the documents. Sign them when you familiarize yourself." She turned to Tricia. "And I advise you to hurry up before I change my mind." Chloe turned around and left the house. Getting into the car, she let herself burst into tears. Her heart was torn with pain and resentment. So many years of marriage. Didn't it mean anything to him? "Chloe Preston, are you sure this is a good idea?" the notary asked with obvious concern. She nodded decisively. "Absolutely," Chloe said confidently, signing the document. "I give a part of my property to Dixon, who after the trial of Grozny's Andrew Evans became the head doctor of the clinic." The notary shook his head. "But this, please." "It's absurd," he muttered. "To give a part of his fortune to a doctor who had been under investigation." "Dixon is a good man," calmly replied Chloe. "He deserves it much more than my unfaithful husband." Having given the necessary orders to the notary, Chloe went to the cemetery to meet her savior. "Chloe, are you serious?" Ethan stood on the doorstep of the old woman, not believing his ears. "Farm? Horses?" She smiled. For the first time in a long time. It was genuine. "Totally serious. I've always dreamed of having a farm. You know about horses, don't you?" "Well, I helped my grandfather in the village when I was a kid," Ethan mumbled embarrassedly. "That's great." Chloe clapped her hands. "So it is decided you will be my partner." Life on the farm was quite different from the life a businesswoman was used to. Early rise, hard work, constant care of animals. But the strange thing was that Chloe felt happy. For the first time in her life, she was doing something she really liked. Ethan turned out to be an indispensable assistant. He quickly mastered all the necessary subtleties of horse care, and soon the farm began to bring profit. Chloe was surprised to discover her talent as a breeder. Her pets were famous for their beauty and grace. At auctions, they were paid fabulous money for them. Who would have thought that you would make such a gambler, Ethan? Here laughed Ethan, watching his wife standing in a snow-white bride's dress. Life is full of surprises, replied Chloe, lovingly stroking her belly. The baby panted playfully from inside. Sometimes you just need a change of scenery to find happiness. Dylan had tried to challenge the divorce decree, but to no avail. All his attempts to regain at least part of Chloe's fortune failed. Tricia found out he was broke and dumped him. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be ridiculed by the whole town?" he whispered, meeting her once on the street. "You ruined my life." She looked at her ex-husband calmly. "Dylan, I didn't ruin your life. You did it yourself when you chose family life over a cheap affair," she said. A year passed. The firm prospered, and Chloe and Ethan got married. Their wedding was modest, but very heartfelt. The witnesses were loyal friends in the person of the head Dr. Dixon and his young wife, Emily. Ben and Preston were the guests of honor. "Chloe, you have given me a new life." "Thank you for what you are," said Ethan, hugging his wife. "You made me happy," she answered, leaning into his shoulder. His eyes shone with love and gratitude. Life, which at first seemed ruined, had found a new meaning, as indicated by the noticeably rounded belly.